Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Thomas Davis, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the summer of 2023, deep in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I've replayed the events in my mind thousands of times, wondering if there was anything I could have done differently. But some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some places should never be disturbed. I'd been planning this trip for months, a week-long hiking expedition with my closest friends from college. We'd been drifting apart over the years, all of us buried in our careers, marriages, and the general chaos of adult life. This trip was supposed to be our reconnection, a chance to rediscover the camaraderie we once shared. There were 5 of us. Me, the de facto leader since I'd planned most of the route through Seneca Creek backcountry. Nate Wilson, my oldest friend, who'd gotten pudgy and serious since becoming a father of twins. Marcus Phillips, still the joker, though the lines around his eyes suggested the corporate world was taking its toll. Diana Roberts, the only woman in our group who'd rejected the traditional path to become an acclaimed wildlife photographer. And finally, Eric Torres, the quiet one who'd always been hesitant but never wanted to miss out. We met at the Seneca Rocks Discovery Center on a muggy Wednesday morning. The air hung thick with moisture, clinging to our skin the moment we stepped out of our air-conditioned cars. The forecast had warned of potential storms later in the week, but the skies that morning were a brilliant blue, stretching endlessly over the ancient rock formations that towered above us. Jesus, Thomas. When you said remote, you weren't kidding, Nate said, squinting up at the jagged peaks of Seneca Rocks. That's the point, I replied, slinging my pack over my shoulder. No cell service, no emails, no distractions. Just us and the wilderness. Diana was already snapping pictures of the limestone formations, her expensive camera clicking rapidly. These rocks are over 440 million years old, she said without looking away from her viewfinder. Formed when this whole area was underwater. Marcus stretched dramatically, his designer hiking boots still pristinely clean. Great! So we're camping in a prehistoric ocean. Should have brought my snorkel. Eric said nothing, just stared up at the rocks with an unreadable expression. I'd had to convince him the hardest to come on this trip. Something about the isolation made him nervous, though he'd never admit it. After checking our supplies one last time and registering our hiking plan with the center, a safety precaution I'd insisted on, we set off toward Seneca Creek Trail. Our plan was to hike about 8 miles that day to reach our first campsite near Seneca Falls. Then we'd continue deeper into the backcountry, exploring some of the lesser-known areas I'd researched. The first few hours were exactly what I'd hoped for. The forest welcomed us with a canopy of ancient hardwoods that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The conversation flowed easily as we fell into our old rhythms, catching up on the minutiae of our lives that social media updates couldn't capture. So, what's the real reason you dragged us all the way out here, Thomas? Marcus asked as we paused at a stream to refill our water bottles. Midlife crisis? Running from the law? Secret treasure hunt? I laughed, activating my water filter. Maybe I just missed your ugly mug. Seriously though, Diana chimed in, her eyes scanning the wilderness around us. You've been planning this trip with an almost obsessive level of detail. What gives? I hesitated. They didn't know about the nightmares I'd been having for months. Dreams of being lost in these very woods, following whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Dreams where I found something ancient and terrible hidden deep in the forest. I'd initially dismissed them as stress-induced nonsense, but when they persisted, becoming more vivid each night, I began to feel drawn to this place, as if something was calling me here. I needed a break, I finally said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Thought you all might need one too. Eric, who had been unusually quiet even for him, suddenly spoke. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" We all turned to look at him. He was staring into the dense forest to our right, his brow furrowed. "Probably just deer," Nate said dismissively. "Or maybe a black bear. They're common around here, but they usually avoid people." "No," Eric said slowly. "It doesn't feel like an animal." "Well, unless the trees have eyes, I think we're alone out here," Marcus joked, but his laugh sounded forced. I felt a chill despite the summer heat. My dreams had started just like this, a feeling of being observed by unseen eyes. "Let's keep moving," I said, perhaps too quickly. "We've still got a few miles to go before we reach the falls." As we continued our hike, the forest began to change subtly around us. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted in ways that seemed almost deliberate. The undergrowth became denser, grabbing at our ankles as if trying to slow our progress. And the birdsong, which had been a constant companion since we'd entered the forest, gradually faded until we were hiking in an unnatural silence. "Anyone else notice how quiet it's gotten?" Diana whispered, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. "Now that you mention it," Nate replied, his voice equally low. "Not even insects." "Probably going to rain," I suggested, glancing at the sky visible through the canopy. It was still blue, but darker clouds were gathering in the distance. Animals often go quiet before a storm. But I knew this wasn't normal. Even before storms, forests don't fall completely silent. There's always something: wind in the leaves, distant bird calls, the rustle of small creatures. This silence was absolute, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We reached Seneca Falls in the late afternoon. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a breathtaking sight. Water cascading down a series of rock shelves into a clear pool below, surrounded by moss-covered boulders and ferns. But in the eerie silence, with the water seeming to fall without making a sound, it felt wrong somehow. Distorted. "This is beautiful," Diana said, but her voice lacked enthusiasm. She raised her camera, then lowered it without taking a picture. We set up camp in a small clearing near the falls. As I hammered stakes into the ground for my tent, I noticed something odd about the soil. It was darker than it should have been, almost black, and it had a strange, sweet smell that reminded me of decaying fruit. "Hey, does the ground seem weird to you guys?" I asked. Marcus looked down, scuffing his boot against the dirt. "Seems normal to me, though I'm not exactly a soil expert." "It's been raining a lot lately," Nate suggested. "Probably just unusually damp." I decided not to push it, but as I finished setting up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place was fundamentally wrong. The silence, the soil, the feeling of being watched. It all matched my dreams with unsettling precision. As dusk approached, we gathered around the fire pit I'd built. It took several attempts to get the fire started. The wood was damp despite there having been no rain, and the flames seemed to sputter and shrink as if fighting against some invisible force. But eventually, we had a modest fire going, casting long shadows that danced among the trees surrounding our camp. "Who wants s'mores?" Marcus asked, pulling out a bag of marshmallows from his pack with a flourish. "Seriously? You hauled marshmallows all the way out here?" Nate laughed. "Some luxuries are worth the extra weight," Marcus replied with a grin. As we roasted marshmallows and passed around a flask of whiskey Eric had brought, the tension that had been building throughout the day began to ease. We shared stories from our college days, laughing at memories of drunken misadventures and failed romances. For a while, it felt like old times. But as the night deepened, the forest around us seemed to close in. The darkness beyond our firelight was absolute, swallowing even the stars that should have been visible through gaps in the canopy. And though there was no wind, I could have sworn I heard whispers coming from that darkness, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human in cadence. "Does anyone else hear that?" I finally asked during a lull in conversation. "Hear what?" Diana asked, tilting her head. I strained to listen, but the whispers had stopped. "Nothing, I guess," Must have been the water. Eric was staring intently into the darkness. I heard it too, he said quietly, like someone talking, but far away. Great, Marcus groaned. You two are creeping me out. Next, you'll be telling us you've seen Mothman. Mothman is from Point Pleasant, Diana corrected. Different part of West Virginia. But these mountains do have their own legends. The Shawnee believed these forests were home to spirit beings they called Manigishi, little trickster people who would lead travelers astray. Well, as long as they don't steal our marshmallows, they can trick all they want, Nate said, but his joke fell flat. We turned in shortly after that, the day's hike having taken its toll. As I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I could hear the others settling into their tents around me. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, listening to the unnatural silence, broken only by the occasional pop from the dying embers of our fire. And then I heard it again. Whispers, closer now, as if someone was standing just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to make out words in the sibilant sounds. Thomas. I froze. That was my name. I was sure of it. Thomas. Come. Find. My heart hammered against my ribs. The voice was neither male nor female, but something in between, with an odd, echoing quality that made it sound as if it was coming from underwater. Slowly, my hands shaking, I unzipped my sleeping bag and reached for my flashlight. The whispers continued, growing more insistent. Thomas. We've been waiting. So long. I crawled to the tent entrance and, after a moment's hesitation, unzipped it just enough to peer out. The clearing was bathed in the pale light of a moon I hadn't noticed earlier. Our campfire had died completely, not even a glowing coal remaining. And standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees, was a figure. It was roughly human in shape, but too tall and too thin, its limbs at odd angles as if broken in multiple places. I couldn't make out its face, if it had one, but I had the distinct impression it was smiling. I must have made a sound because the figure tilted its head in an unnatural, jerky motion, like a puppet controlled by inexperienced hands. Found you! The whisper came, and this time I was certain it wasn't audible in the conventional sense. The words formed directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. I scrambled backward, zipping the tent closed as if the thin fabric could offer any protection. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I fumbled for my flashlight, finally managing to turn it on. The beam cut through the darkness of my tent, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Just my sleeping bag, my backpack, and the book I'd brought but hadn't opened. I sat there, flashlight clutched in my trembling hand, for what seemed like hours. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of tall, thin figures leading me deeper into the forest, towards something ancient and hungry that waited in the darkness. I woke to the sound of birdsong, a normal, natural sound that brought immediate relief. Sunlight filtered through the walls of my tent, casting everything in a warm glow that made the terrors of the night seem like nothing more than an overactive imagination, fueled by ghost stories and exhaustion. Emerging from my tent, I found Diana already up, boiling water on the small camping stove for coffee. "Morning," she said with a smile. "Sleep well?" "Not really," I admitted, accepting the cup of instant coffee she offered. "Had some weird dreams." "Same here," she said, glancing toward the falls. "Something about this place. It gets into your head." One by one, the others emerged from their tents. Nate looked like he hadn't slept at all, dark circles under his eyes, while Marcus seemed annoyingly well rested. Eric was the last to appear, and when he did, I noticed he was wearing the same clothes as yesterday, as if he'd slept in them. "Did anyone go for a walk last night?" Eric asked as he poured himself coffee with shaking hands. We all shook our heads. "Why do you ask?" I ventured, a knot forming in my stomach. Eric frowned. "I thought I saw someone walking around the camp. Figured it was one of you going to take a leak or something." "What time was this?" Diana asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I don't know. Late, after everyone had gone to bed." Marcus laughed nervously. "Maybe it was your Manigishi, Diana." But no one found it funny this time. We broke camp in near silence, the brief normalcy of the morning shattered. Our plan was to continue deeper into the backcountry, following Seneca Creek upstream to a series of smaller waterfalls that few hikers ever visited. Part of me wanted to suggest turning back, returning to the safety of civilization. But a stronger part, the part that had been dreaming of this place for months, pushed me forward. The day was overcast, the bright blue sky of yesterday replaced by a solid layer of gray clouds that hung low over the mountains. The air was thick with humidity, making it feel as if we were walking through soup. And though birds sang and insects buzzed, the forest still felt wrong somehow, as if it was wearing a mask of normalcy that could drop at any moment. We hiked in silence for the most part, each lost in our own thoughts. The trail became less defined as we moved away from the more frequently visited areas, forcing us to navigate by map and compass. Several times, I had to backtrack when the path I was following disappeared into impenetrable underbrush. "Are you sure you know where we're going?" Nate asked after the third such detour. "We seem to be going in circles." I consulted my map again, frowning. "We should be heading northwest, following the creek. But you're right, something's off." "Maybe we should head back to the main trail," Diana suggested. "Stick to the marked routes." But even as she spoke, I realized I wasn't entirely sure which direction we'd come from. The forest looked the same in every direction: dense trees, undergrowth, and the ever-present feeling of being watched. "Let's try this way," I said, pointing in what I hoped was the right direction. "The creek should be just beyond those trees." We pushed through a particularly dense patch of rhododendrons, their twisted branches seeming to grab at our clothes and packs. When we emerged on the other side, we found ourselves in a small clearing dominated by a massive oak tree. The tree was ancient, its trunk wider than any I'd ever seen, its bark blackened as if by fire, and carved into that bark was a symbol, a spiral pattern that seemed to move if you looked at it too long. "What the hell is that?" Marcus whispered, staring at the symbol. "Some kind of trail marker?" Nate suggested without conviction. Diana approached the tree slowly, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck. "No," she said. "This is something else. Something old." As if in response, a whisper swept through the clearing. Too faint to make out words, but unmistakably the same voice I'd heard the night before. From the way everyone tensed, I knew they'd heard it too. "Okay, I'm officially freaked out," Marcus said, backing away from the tree. "Let's get the hell out of here." No one argued. We turned to leave the clearing, only to find that the dense rhododendrons we'd pushed through had been replaced by an open path leading into darkness, a path that definitely hadn't been there before. "This isn't right," Eric muttered, his face pale. "None of this is right." "Just stay calm," I said, trying to keep the panic from my voice. "We must have gotten turned around. Let's use the compass." I pulled out my compass, but the needle spun wildly, unable to find north. The others watched in silence, the implications sinking in. "Okay," I said, putting the useless compass away. "We follow the creek. Water flows downhill, so if we follow it downstream, we'll eventually reach civilization." It was a sound plan, but there was one problem. We couldn't find the creek. It should have been within earshot. The sound of running water carries far in the forest, but there was nothing except that unnatural silence that seemed to come and go without pattern. "This is impossible," Nate said, his voice rising. "A creek doesn't just disappear." "Maybe we're further off course than I thought," I admitted. "Let's pick a direction and stick to it." "And which direction would that be?" Marcus snapped. "The compass doesn't work. We can't find the creek, and for all we know, we're walking in circles." "Stop it," Diana cut in sharply. "Fighting won't help. We need to stay together and think logically." She was right. Of course, panic would only make our situation worse. We decided to make camp where we were, in the clearing with the marked tree, and try to get our bearings in the morning. None of us was happy about spending another night in the forest, especially near that tree, but with dusk approaching and no clear path out, we had little choice. Setting up camp was a tense affair. The ground here had the same strange, dark quality I'd noticed at our previous site, and the air felt oddly charged, as if a thunderstorm was brewing just beyond the horizon. The whispers came and went, never quite loud enough to understand, but always present at the edges of our awareness. "I feel like I'm losing my mind," Eric confessed as we gathered around another struggling campfire. "Last night, after I saw that person walking around camp, I had these dreams. Dreams about a place deep in the forest where the trees grow wrong and the ground is black like coal." I stared at him, a chill running down my spine. "With figures that are too tall and thin, moving like broken puppets?" Eric's eyes widened. "You've had the same dream." "Not just last night," I admitted. "For months. It's why I wanted to come here. I thought if I saw this place in real life, the dreams would stop making sense, and I could move on. But instead, we're living them," Diana finished softly. Marcus looked between us, his usual joking demeanor completely gone. "So, what are we dealing with here? Some kind of mass hallucination? Gas leaking from the ground making us all have the same psychotic break? Or maybe the legends are true," Nate suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. "Diana said the Shawnee believed in spirits that led travelers astray." "Managishi," Diana nodded, "but they were usually described as small, mischievous beings. What we're experiencing feels darker." No one wanted to say it aloud, but we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever was happening in these woods was beyond our understanding, beyond logic or science. We were being led somewhere, or to something, and our choices were rapidly narrowing. That night, we decided no one should sleep alone. We arranged our tents in a tight circle around the fire, which we planned to keep burning all night. Marcus volunteered for the first watch, with the rest of us trying to get some sleep before our own shifts. I shared my tent with Eric, while Nate and Diana took the other. Despite the exhaustion weighing down my limbs, sleep felt dangerous, an invitation to whatever presence had invaded our dreams. But eventually, the rhythmic sound of Eric's breathing lulled me into a fitful doze. The whispers woke me, loud now, insistent, coming from all directions at once. I sat up, disoriented, and realized I was alone in the tent. Eric's sleeping bag was empty. The zipper of the tent entrance opened to the night. Panicking, I scrambled outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to see that Marcus was gone from his post. In fact, the entire campsite was deserted. "Nate," I called. "Diana, Eric, Marcus." My voice sounded flat in the dense air, going nowhere. And then, from the darkness beyond the trees, came a response. Not my friends' voices, but that same whispering that had haunted us since we arrived. "Thomas, come. They're waiting." I should have stayed put, should have waited for dawn, for my friends to return, for some semblance of sanity to reassert itself. But the voice pulled at me like a physical force, drawing me toward the trees. And beneath my fear was a terrible curiosity, a need to know what waited in the darkness, what had been calling me for months across hundreds of miles. I grabbed my flashlight and plunged into the forest. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, revealing only a few feet of twisted undergrowth and gnarled tree trunks. But there was a path of sorts, areas where the vegetation had been crushed by the passage of multiple people. "Eric!" I called again. "Marcus, where are you guys?" The only answer was the whispers, growing louder as I followed the path deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little moonlight might have filtered through. The air grew colder, my breath forming clouds in front of my face despite it being the middle of summer. And then I smelled smoke. Not the pleasant campfire kind, but something acrid and chemical. Following the scent, I emerged into another clearing, much larger than the one we'd camped in. and in the center of that clearing was a sight that stopped me cold. A structure of sorts rose from the ground, a crude temple or altar made of branches woven together in impossible ways, creating a dome-like shape with an opening at the top. The ground around it was black and slick, resembling the strange soil I'd noticed, but more extreme, as if the earth itself had been charred by intense heat. And surrounding the structure, arranged in a perfect circle, were figures. In the dim light, I couldn't make out details at first. I thought they might be standing stones or tree stumps. But as my eyes adjusted, horror crawled up my spine. They weren't stones. They were people, my friends among them, standing absolutely motionless, arms at their sides, faces titled upward toward the opening in the dome. "Nate?" I whispered, approaching the nearest figure. "Marcus? Guys, what are you doing?" None of them responded or gave any indication they'd heard me. Their eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing, and standing among them, interspersed with my friends, were the tall, thin figures from my dreams. Their bodies bent at impossible angles, their faces smooth and featureless except for wide, grinning mouths filled with needle-like teeth. One of these creatures turned its head toward me with that same jerky, puppet-like motion I'd seen the night before. Though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze boring into me. "You're late, Thomas," it whispered directly into my mind. "The calling has already begun." "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. "What do you want with us?" "We are the Forgotten Ones," the creature replied. "Those who dwelled here long before your kind. We sleep beneath the earth, waking only when the stars align. And we hunger." It gestured toward the dome with one elongated arm. "Your friends have given themselves to us willingly, their minds already consumed by our whispers. You alone resisted longer than most. But in the end, all who hear our call must answer." As if on cue, my friends began to move, stepping forward in perfect unison toward the dome. I tried to grab Eric as he passed me, but my hand went right through his arm as if he were made of smoke. "No!" I shouted. "Stop! Whatever you're doing to them, stop it now!" The creature tilted its head, that terrible grin widening. "They go to feed the mother, the ancient one who sleeps beneath the black soil. With their essence, she will wake from her long slumber, and this forest, this world, will be remade in her image." Terror, unlike anything I'd ever known, gripped me as my friends filed into the dome, disappearing into darkness. I wanted to run, to flee this nightmare and never look back. But these were my friends. I had led them here. Whatever happened to them was my responsibility. With a courage born of desperation, I lunged toward the dome, determined to pull them out by force if necessary. But the creature moved with inhuman speed, suddenly standing between me and the entrance. "You cannot interfere," it hissed. "The ritual has begun, but fear not, you will join them soon enough. The Mother has special plans for you, Dreamwalker, you who heard her call across such distance." "I'm not joining anything," I growled, backing away. "And neither are my friends." My hand closed around the canister of bear spray attached to my belt, a precaution I'd insisted everyone carry in these woods. Before the creature could react, I aimed and pressed the trigger, sending a cloud of capsaicin directly into its face. I didn't expect it to work. These things weren't bears or even human, but to my shock, the creature recoiled with a high-pitched shriek that hurt my ears. It clawed at its featureless face with those long, too-many-jointed fingers as the spray made contact. Taking advantage of its distraction, I darted past it into the dome. Inside was pitch black, the air thick with that same acrid smoke I'd smelled earlier. I fumbled with my flashlight, finally managing to turn it on. The beam revealed a horrifying sight. My friends stood in another circle around a pit in the center of the dome. The pit was deep, deeper than seemed possible given the normal topography of the area, and filled with a writhing darkness that my mind couldn't quite process. Tendrils of that darkness were reaching up, caressing my friends' faces with what looked almost like affection. "Guys," I shouted, grabbing Diana's shoulder and spinning her around. "We need to get out of here now." Her eyes were black pools, no whites or irises visible. But at the sound of my voice, something flickered in those depths. A momentary recognition. "Thomas?" she mumbled, her voice distant. What's happening?" "No time to explain," I said, pulling her toward the entrance. "Help me get the others." With Diana partially awake from whatever trance had gripped them, we managed to rouse Nate and Marcus. Eric was the hardest to reach, standing closest to the pit with the dark tendrils almost completely enveloping him. "Eric!" I yelled, fighting my way to his side. "Eric, snap out of it!" When he turned to me, his face was already changing, the skin turning gray and taut across his skull, his mouth stretching wider than any human mouth should be able to. "Too late," he said, but the voice wasn't his. He is already part of the mother. Outside the dome, I could hear the shrieks of the creatures as more of them converged on our location. We were out of time. "We have to go," Diana urged, pulling at my arm. "Thomas, we have to go now." With the most gut-wrenching decision of my life, I turned away from Eric. There was nothing left of my friend in those black eyes, just an ancient hunger that would consume us all if we stayed. We burst out of the dome to find the clearing filled with the tall, thin creatures, all converging on us with those jerky, broken movements. The bear spray had only momentarily stunned the first one, and now it led the charge, its featureless face split by that too-wide grin. "Run!" I shouted, pushing Diana, Nate, and Marcus ahead of me. "Don't stop! Don't look back!" We plunged into the forest, branches whipping at our faces as we ran blindly through the darkness. Behind us, the shrieks of the creatures rose to a fever pitch, accompanied by a deeper sound. A rumbling from deep within the earth that seemed to make the very ground beneath our feet shudder. "The mother is waking," Diana gasped as we ran. "Whatever these things are feeding her, it's working." I didn't want to think about what that meant for Eric, what was happening to him in that pit of writhing darkness. I just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, keeping my friends moving, trying to find a way out of this nightmare forest that seemed to have no end. We ran for what felt like hours, the sky above us lightening from black to a sick, yellowish gray as dawn approached. The shrieks behind us gradually faded, but the rumbling continued, growing stronger with each passing minute. Cracks began to appear in the ground, venting that same acrid smoke we'd smelled in the dome. "We need to find the creek," I panted, my lungs burning. "Follow it downstream." "There!" Nate pointed to our right where the ground sloped down into a narrow ravine. "I can hear water." Sure enough, the sound of rushing water cut through the rumbling. We scrambled down the slope, slipping on loose rocks and damp soil, until we reached the bank of what had to be Seneca Creek, though it looked wrong somehow, the water darker and thicker than it should have been. "Downstream," I insisted, pointing to our left. "That should lead us back to the main trail, eventually to the road." We followed the creek as it wound through the forest, the sky continuing to lighten though the sun itself remained hidden behind thick clouds. The trees around us were changing, becoming less twisted and more natural the further we went. The ground beneath our feet transitioned from that strange black soil to normal forest floor, covered in decaying leaves and moss, and then, so suddenly it seemed like magic, we broke through the tree line onto a gravel road. The Seneca Rocks Discovery Center stood about a half-mile down that road, its wooden structure the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We collapsed onto the gravel, our legs finally giving out now that safety was in sight. Behind us, the rumbling had stopped, and the forest looked almost normal in the early morning light. Just trees and shadows, no sign of the nightmare we'd experienced. "Eric," Marcus finally said, breaking the silence. We left Eric behind. "That wasn't Eric anymore," Diana said softly, tears streaking the dirt on her face. "You saw him. Whatever those things are, they'd already taken him." Nate was staring back at the forest, his expression haunted. "What were they? What was that thing in the pit?" I shook my head, unable to find words to describe the horror we'd witnessed. I don't know. Something old. Something that should have stayed buried. We made our way to the Discovery Center when it opened an hour later, telling the rangers a sanitized version of events, that we'd gotten lost, that Eric had fallen into a ravine, that we'd been unable to reach him. They sent out a search party, but I knew they wouldn't find him. Not the real Eric, anyway. In the years since, I've researched extensively, trying to make sense of what happened in those woods. The Seneca and Shawnee legends speak of dark spirits that dwell beneath the earth, each awakening in cycles to feed on the living. Colonial records mention entire settlements that disappeared near what is now the Monongahela National Forest, the only clue to their fate being journal entries describing whispers in the night and tall, thin figures watching from the trees. The nightmares continue, though less frequently now. In them, I see Eric, or what used to be Eric, standing at the edge of that pit, his body elongating and twisting into shapes no human should be able to make, his face splitting into that terrible grin. And sometimes I hear the whispers again, calling me back to those dark woods, to the ancient hunger that waits beneath the black soil. I will never return to Seneca Creek. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is hidden and the darkness feels too complete, I wonder if part of those woods came back with me, a seed of that ancient evil, planted deep in my mind, growing stronger with each passing day. And I wonder, with growing dread, if someday I'll answer the call that never truly stopped whispering my name. My name is Helen Turner, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the most remote part of Monongahela National Forest, West Virginia, near a place locals call the Hollows. I've always prided myself on my independence. Living in Pittsburgh meant I was just a few hours' drive from some of the most beautiful wilderness the Appalachians had to offer, and I took full advantage of it. My therapist had actually encouraged my solo hiking trips as a healthy way to process my grief after losing my sister Megan to a car accident last year. The isolation in nature helped quiet the guilt that had haunted me since our final argument, the one where I told her I never wanted to speak to her again. Words I could never take back. This particular trip was meant to be a 4-day expedition to Spruce Knob and the surrounding wilderness. I'd researched the area thoroughly, or so I thought. The online forums mentioned breathtaking views, challenging terrain, and an old fire tower that offered panoramic vistas of the surrounding mountains. What they didn't mention were the stories that locals apparently shared in hushed tones over beer at the only diner in the nearest town of Whitmer. Stories about hikers who ventured too deep into certain valleys and never returned. I should have paid more attention when I stopped for supplies at the general store in Whitmer. The elderly cashier had given me an odd look when I showed her my planned route on the map. "You heading up there alone?" she'd asked, her weathered fingers tapping at a particular valley on my map. "Yes, ma'am. Been planning it for months." I smiled, trying to project confidence. She'd pursed her lips and shaken her head. "You might want to stay on the main trails, especially after dark. Some places don't take kindly to visitors." I'd laughed it off. Locals always had their superstitions, their ways of keeping pristine spots to themselves. I'd encountered similar warnings before. "I appreciate the concern, but I've been doing solo hikes for years," I assured her. The woman had simply handed me my change with a tight smile. "Well, if you do go that way, don't disturb anything that looks old. And if you hear singing when there shouldn't be any, turn around and head back the way you came." I nodded politely, but internally rolled my eyes. Classic rural folklore meant to spook outsiders. The first day of hiking was everything I'd hoped for. Early May, in the Monongahela, meant the forest was alive with new growth. The ground was carpeted with trilliums and wild geraniums, and the trees were dressed in that particular shade of spring green that seems to glow from within. I made good time, setting up camp that evening near a small stream about 8 miles into my planned route. The sunset painted the sky in strokes of orange and pink, and as darkness settled, I felt that familiar sense of peace that only comes from being completely alone in the wilderness. That first night passed uneventfully, though I did wake once to the sound of something moving through the undergrowth near my tent. Probably just a deer, I thought before drifting back to sleep. The second day is when things began to change. I woke to a dense fog that clung to the landscape, transforming the familiar forest into something ethereal and strange. My campsite, which had seemed so pleasant the evening before, now felt oppressive, as if the trees had somehow crept closer during the night. I tried to shake off the feeling as I prepared a simple breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee. My planned route would take me deeper into the forest, toward a valley that supposedly contained some interesting limestone formations and a lesser-known waterfall. According to my map, it was about 7 miles from my current position. I packed up my gear, double-checked my compass, and set off. The fog persisted throughout the morning, making navigation more challenging than I'd anticipated. The trail gradually became less distinct until I found myself frequently consulting both map and compass to ensure I was still heading in the right direction. The forest seemed unusually quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the soft crunch of my boots on pine needles and my own breathing. Around midday, I reached what I thought was the entrance to the valley I'd been heading for. The fog had finally begun to lift, revealing steep slopes rising on either side of a narrow passage between 2 ridges. Something about the place made me hesitate. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as I stood at the threshold, and the silence deepened, becoming almost tangible. I checked my map again. This had to be it. Elkins Valley, named after an old logging family, according to my research. Yet nothing about it matched the descriptions I'd read online. There were no hikers' cairns marking the way, no signs of the well-trodden path that should have led to the waterfall. Still, I pressed on. I'd come too far to turn back now, and my stubborn streak had gotten me through tougher situations before. As I entered the valley, the path descended steeply, taking me deeper into shadow. Old-growth trees towered overhead, their canopies so dense that little sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The vegetation changed too, becoming more lush, almost tropical in its density, which was odd for this elevation in West Virginia. After about an hour of careful hiking, I came across the first strange thing: a small circle of stones in a small clearing. The stones were arranged too perfectly to be natural, each about the size of a human head, with strange symbols carved into their surfaces. In the center of the circle was what appeared to be an animal skull, too large for a deer, too small for a bear, with an oddly elongated jaw. A chill ran down my spine as the cashier's words echoed in my mind. "Don't disturb anything that looks old." I gave the stone circle a wide berth and continued on my way, but my unease was growing. The path, such as it was, seemed to be leading me further down into the valley rather than toward the waterfall that should have been visible by now. I checked my phone's GPS, but there was no signal. My compass, which had been working perfectly all morning, now spun erratically, the needle whirling in complete circles before stopping, then spinning again. That should have been my first sign to turn back. Instead, I convinced myself there must be unusual mineral deposits in the area affecting the compass. I decided to rely on my map and the position of the sun, which was now occasionally visible through breaks in the canopy. By late afternoon, I realized I was well and truly lost. The valley seemed to have closed in around me, the slopes on either side growing steeper until they were nearly vertical walls. The forest had changed again, too. The trees here were ancient, gnarled things with twisted trunks and branches that seemed to reach out like arthritic fingers. Their roots erupted from the ground in tangled masses, making the terrain increasingly difficult to navigate. The light was fading faster than it should have been, and the temperature continued to drop. I needed to find a suitable place to make camp for the night. After another half hour of careful progress, I came upon a relatively flat area beside a small, dark pool fed by a trickle of water from the rocks above. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. As I set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes I would stop and scan the surrounding forest, but there was never anything there, just shadows and silence. The usual forest sounds that should have emerged at dusk, the hooting of owls, the chirping of insects, were conspicuously absent. I forced myself to eat some trail mix and jerky, though my appetite had vanished. Night fell with unnatural swiftness, and with it came a cold that penetrated through my layers of technical clothing and seemed to settle in my bones. I built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, but the flames burned strangely, too blue, too dim, as if something in the air was smothering them. That night I slept fitfully, waking often to every small sound. Around what must have been midnight, I jolted awake to a noise that made my blood run cold. Singing. A woman's voice, distant but clear, singing a melody I didn't recognize in words I couldn't understand. The voice seemed to be coming from deeper in the valley, and there was something profoundly wrong about it. A hollowness, as if the sound was emanating from something that only approximated a human throat. The cashier's second warning crashed into my consciousness. If you hear singing when there shouldn't be any, turn around and head back the way you came. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, as the singing continued. It remained distant, but something about it suggested that the source was moving, perhaps coming closer. After what seemed like an eternity, the voice faded, and eventually exhaustion pulled me back into an uneasy sleep. I woke to the sound of rain pattering against my tent. Daylight had returned, though the heavy cloud cover made it difficult to tell what time it was. My watch said 8:17 a.m., but it seemed darker than it should have been. I packed up quickly, eager to find my way back to the main trail and out of this increasingly unsettling valley. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Small, muddy footprints circling my tent. They were too small to be an adult's, about the size of a child's, but the shape was off. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced, and they stopped abruptly at the entrance to my tent, as if whatever had made them had stood there, watching me sleep. My hands trembled as I finished packing. I needed to get out of there. Now. I decided to try retracing my steps from the previous day, hoping to find the point where I'd gone wrong and get back to the main trail. The rain continued as I made my way back up the valley, turning the ground into slick mud that made the going treacherous. After about an hour, I came to a horrifying realization. Nothing looked familiar. Not the trees, not the rock formations, not the contours of the land. It was as if the valley itself had rearranged while I slept. My fear was beginning to edge toward panic when I spotted something through the trees, what looked like a structure of some kind. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was a ranger station or a hiker's shelter, somewhere I could reorient myself and possibly find help. As I drew closer, my hope withered. It wasn't a ranger station, but an old cabin. Its log walls grayed with age, its small windows dark and empty as eye sockets. The roof sagged ominously in the middle, and the single door hung askew on rusted hinges. Everything about the place screamed abandonment and decay, yet there was smoke rising from the stone chimney. I stood at the edge of the small clearing, rain dripping from my hood, frozen in indecision. On one hand, there was clearly someone here who might be able to help me find my way out. On the other, every instinct was screaming that something was deeply wrong with this place. Need won out over caution. I approached the cabin slowly, calling out as I did. "Hello? Is anyone there? I'm a hiker and I've lost my way. Could you help me with directions?" No response. The only sound was the steady drumming of rain on leaves and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. I reached the door and, after a moment's hesitation, knocked. The wood felt oddly warm beneath my knuckles, despite the cold rain. When no one answered, I gently pushed the door open. "Hello, I'm coming in, just looking for help." The interior of the cabin was a single room, dimly lit by the gray daylight filtering through the dirty windows and the orange glow of embers in the stone fireplace. A rough wooden table stood in the center, 2 chairs beside it. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall, covered with what looked like animal furs. Dried herbs and what I first took to be wind chimes hung from the rafters, until I looked closer and realized they were small bones strung together with sinew. My breath caught in my throat. On the table was a collection of objects that seemed deliberately arranged. A silver locket that looked strangely familiar, a man's wristwatch with a cracked face, several rings, a driver's license, and, my heart nearly stopped, a red bandana identical to the one my sister Megan had been wearing the day she died. It couldn't be the same one. It couldn't be. Megan had died in Pittsburgh, hundreds of miles from here. She'd never even been to West Virginia. Yet, as I approached the table, drawn by a terrible certainty, I saw that beside the bandana was a small silver charm in the shape of a turtle, the exact charm I'd given Megan for her 16th birthday, the one she'd attached to her keychain and carried everywhere. My fingers trembled as I reached for it. The metal was cold against my skin, the familiar weight of it sending a shock of recognition through me. It was hers. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. She wasn't supposed to be on that road. The voice came from behind me, causing me to spin around with a strangled cry. An old woman stood in the doorway, rain dripping from a crude poncho made of what looked like oiled animal hide. Her face was a mass of wrinkles, her eyes so deeply set they appeared as dark hollows in her skull-like face. Her hair, white as bone, hung in wet strands around her shoulders. "What did you say?" My voice was barely a whisper. The old woman stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She moved with surprising grace for someone who appeared so ancient. "Your sister, Megan. She wasn't supposed to be on that road that night. She was supposed to be home, safe in her bed. But you two quarreled, and she drove off angry, not watching where she was going." She tilted her head, studying me with those bottomless eyes. "Isn't that right, Helen?" My blood turned to ice. I'd never mentioned my name, or Megan's. I'd spoken to no one in this valley except the echo of my own voice calling out moments ago. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "How do you know these things?" The old woman moved to the fireplace, prodding the embers with a stick. They flared briefly, illuminating her face with an orange glow that made her appear even more corpse-like. "People call me Granny Elkins when they speak of me at all. As for how I know..." She turned those terrible eyes back to me. "The forest tells me things. The trees, the stones, the water. They all whisper secrets to those who know how to listen." Granny Elkins. The valley was named after her family, but that would mean. "This valley has belonged to my family since before there was a United States," she said, as if reading my thoughts. "We've kept its secrets, and it has kept ours." I clutched Megan's charm in my fist, feeling the edges dig into my palm. "What does my sister have to do with any of this? How did you get her things?" The old woman smiled, revealing teeth that were surprisingly white and even. "I didn't take them. She gave them to me." "That's impossible. My sister is dead." "Is she?" Granny Elkins moved to the table and ran a gnarled finger over Megan's bandana. "Death isn't always what people think it is, girl. Sometimes it's just a door to somewhere else." I felt dizzy, the cabin seeming to tilt around me. This couldn't be happening. It was a trick, some kind of sick joke. This woman was clearly deranged, a hermit who'd stumbled upon my sister's belongings somehow and constructed an elaborate fantasy. "I want to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just tell me how to get back to the main trail, and I'll go." Granny Elkins laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "It's not that simple, girl. The valley brought you here for a reason. It doesn't let go of what it claims so easily." "What are you talking about? It's just a valley, just a place." She shook her head slowly. "This land is old, Helen. Older than you can imagine. The settlers who came here, my ancestors included, They learned quickly that this place had its own rules, its own hunger. They made a pact, a bargain of sorts. Her voice dropped to a whisper. We feed it, and it provides for us. A chill that had nothing to do with the damp cold ran through me. Feeds on what? Her smile widened. Grief, guilt, regret, all those delicious emotions that humans carry around like poison in their hearts. She leaned closer. Your sister found her way here too, you know. Not physically, but her spirit, her essence. Drawn by your guilt, your unresolved pain over your last words to her. My legs gave out, and I sank into one of the chairs. This was madness. Complete madness. And yet, the charm in my hand was real. The bandana on the table was real. I've heard her singing, I whispered, the memory of that hollow voice in the night suddenly taking on new, terrible significance. Granny Elkins nodded. She's been waiting for you. They all have. They? The others who found their way here, lost in their own ways, carrying their own burdens. She gestured to the other items on the table. The watch, the rings, the license. All of them connected to someone who wandered into my valley, just like you. I stood abruptly, knocking the chair over behind me. I'm leaving. Now. I moved toward the door, but Granny Elkins made no move to stop me. You can try, she said mildly, but the valley has its own ideas about that. It's been feeding on your guilt since the moment you entered, growing stronger with every step you took deeper into its heart. It won't let such a feast go easily. I yanked the door open and burst back out into the rain, which had intensified into a downpour. Thunder cracked overhead, and for a brief moment, lightning illuminated the clearing and the figures standing at the edge of the forest. There were at least a dozen of them, unnaturally still, their forms indistinct in the gloom. But one stood slightly apart from the others, and even through the curtain of rain, I recognized the silhouette, the particular way she held her head, the curve of her shoulders. Megan. I stumbled backward, colliding with the doorframe. The lightning faded, plunging the clearing back into gray twilight, and the figures were no longer visible. But I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. What do they want? I gasped, turning back to Granny Elkins, who stood unmoved by the fireplace. The same thing everyone wants, girl. Resolution. Peace. She picked up a small jar from the mantel and removed the lid, releasing the scent of dried herbs and something sharper, metallic. Your sister didn't pass over properly. Your unresolved guilt, your refusal to let her go, it's kept her bound to this world, to this place. She can't rest until you do. I don't understand. What are you saying? Granny Elkins began to sprinkle the contents of the jar onto the embers. A thick, sweet-smelling smoke rose from the fireplace. I'm saying you have a choice to make. You can join her, let the valley take you both to whatever comes next. Or you can release her, truly mourn her and let her go, but that means facing your guilt, accepting your part in her death. The smoke was filling the cabin now, making my head swim. I knew I should run, get as far away from this place as possible, but my limbs felt leaden, unresponsive. This isn't real, I muttered, fighting to stay upright as the room began to spin around me. You've drugged me. Some kind of hallucinogen in that smoke. Believe what you want, Granny Elkins replied, her voice seeming to come from very far away. But your sister is waiting, and she's growing impatient. I collapsed to my knees, the floor tilting beneath me. Through the open door, I could see the rain had stopped and darkness had fallen. A figure stood in the doorway now. Megan, exactly as she'd looked the last time I saw her alive, down to the red bandana tied around her neck. But her eyes were wrong. Empty, black pools that reflected no light. Helen, she said, in that hollow voice I'd heard singing in the night. You told me you never wanted to speak to me again, but I need to hear your voice now. I need to hear you say you're sorry. Megan, I choked out, tears streaming down my face. I am sorry, so sorry. I didn't mean it. please." She moved toward me, her movements jerky, wrong, like a marionette controlled by unskilled hands. "Not good enough, Helen. Words are just air. I need more." Behind her, more figures appeared at the door, men and women of all ages, all with those same terrible black eyes. They began to file into the cabin, surrounding me in a tightening circle. Granny Elkins stood among them now, suddenly looking younger, her back straight, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "The valley needs to feed, Helen, and you've brought it such a feast with your pain." I closed my eyes, unable to bear the sight of that mockery of my sister, those hollow-eyed specters closing in around me. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be real. I was hallucinating, or having some kind of mental breakdown. I needed to ground myself, to find something real to hold on to. The charm. It was still clutched in my fist. I focused on it, on its solid weight, its sharp edges digging into my palm. It was real. And if it was real, then maybe. My eyes snapped open. The cabin was gone. I was lying on damp ground in the forest, rain dripping through the canopy overhead. My backpack was still on, the straps cutting into my shoulders. Night had fallen, and in the distance I could see the flickering light of what might be a campfire. I struggled to my feet, disoriented. Had I fallen? Hit my head? The last clear memory I had was entering the valley, finding that circle of stones. My hand was still clenched around something. When I opened it, Megan's turtle charm lay on my palm, gleaming dully in what little light penetrated the forest. It hadn't been a hallucination, or at least not entirely. The light in the distance was moving now, coming closer. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, accompanied by voices calling out, "Hello? Is someone there? Search and rescue. They must have been alerted when I didn't check in at my scheduled time." Relief flooded through me, making my knees weak. "Here!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "I'm here!" The beam of light swung in my direction, and figures emerged from the gloom. 2 men in the distinctive uniforms of the Forest Service. "Ma'am, are you Helen Turner?" one of them asked as they reached me. "We've had search parties out looking for you for the past day and a half." Day and a half? That couldn't be right. I'd only been in the valley since yesterday. "Yes, I'm Helen," I confirmed, clutching the charm tighter. "I got lost. I think I fell. How did you find me?" The 2 rangers exchanged glances. "An anonymous call came into the station," the first one said. "Elderly woman said she knew exactly where to find you, gave us very specific directions." The second ranger looked around nervously. "We're about 2 miles from where your car is parked, ma'am. This area isn't even on any of the hiking trails. In fact," he hesitated, "this part of the forest has been closed to the public for years. There was a series of disappearances back in the 90s, never solved." I felt the blood drain from my face. "An elderly woman, you said?" The first ranger nodded. "Yep, wouldn't give her name, but she knew yours. Said you'd be needing help getting out of Elkins Valley." "But we're not in Elkins Valley," the second ranger interjected. "That's about 5 miles west of here. This is Harper's Hollow." I looked down at the charm in my hand, then back up at the rangers. Can you get me out of here, please?" "Of course, ma'am. That's why we're here." The first ranger offered me a water bottle, which I accepted gratefully. "Are you injured? Can you walk?" I nodded, taking a long drink. The water tasted sweeter than any I could remember. "I think so. I just want to go home." As they led me through the forest, their powerful flashlights illuminating the path, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Once, I thought I heard singing in the distance, that same eerie melody from before, but when I stopped to listen, there was only the sound of rain dripping from leaves and our own footsteps crunching on the forest floor. It took about an hour to reach the ranger station where my car was parked. The rangers wanted me to go to a hospital to get checked out, but I insisted I was fine, just tired and ready to get home. They made me sign a form releasing them from liability, and finally I was allowed to leave. As I drove away from Monongahela National Forest, the events of the past 2 days, or was it 3, already began to take on the quality of a nightmare, something not quite real. But Megan's charm sat on the passenger seat beside me, undeniably solid, undeniably hers. When I reached cell service again, I had dozens of missed calls and texts, friends, co-workers, my parents, all wondering where I was, if I was okay. Apparently, I'd been missing for 4 days, not the 2 I thought had passed. I pulled over at a gas station to call my parents, to let them know I was safe. As I waited for the call to connect, I picked up Megan's charm, turning it over in my fingers. On the back, barely visible in the dim light of my car, were scratches that hadn't been there before. Scratches that, when I looked closely, formed words. "Let me go." My mother answered the phone, her voice choked with tears of relief when she heard mine. After assuring her I was fine and would be home soon, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned. "Mom, I need to visit Megan's grave when I get back." There was a pause on the other end. "Of course, sweetheart. Any particular reason?" I looked at the charm in my hand, at those scratched words. "I just need to say goodbye properly. There are things I need to say to her that I never did." "I understand," my mother said softly. "We'll go together." As I hung up and pulled back onto the road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, an elderly woman with white hair watching me drive away. But when I blinked, there was nothing there but darkness and the fading lights of the gas station. I drove through the night, putting as much distance between myself and Monongahela Forest as possible. Yet, even as the miles accumulated, I couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed me out of that valley. Not Megan, not Granny Elkins, but something older and hungrier, something that had gotten a taste of my guilt and grief and wouldn't easily let such a feast go. 3 weeks have passed since then. I did visit Megan's grave, spoke the words I needed to say, cried the tears I'd been holding back for a year. I left her charm there, buried in the soil beside her headstone. It felt right, like closing a circle. But sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I still wake to the sound of singing, a woman's voice, hollow and wrong, singing words I can't understand. And I wonder if I ever truly left Elkins Valley, or if part of me will always be there, caught in that twilight place between grief and acceptance, between the living and the dead. I won't be going back to West Virginia. Some places, as the cashier in Whitmer warned me, don't take kindly to visitors. And some visitors, I've learned, take a piece of those places with them when they leave. A piece that can never be returned. My name is Laura Adams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Otter Creek Wilderness area of Monongahela National Forest, West Virginia, 3 years ago. But the memories remain as vivid as open wounds. I'd recently finalized my divorce from Eric after 8 years of marriage. 8 years of trying to please someone who viewed my existence as an inconvenience. 8 years of diminishing myself until I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. The divorce left me hollow, a ghost haunting my own life. My therapist, Dr. Winters, suggested I reconnect with activities I loved before meeting Eric. Before his constant criticism made me abandon everything that once brought me joy. "Reclaim yourself," she said during our last session. "Find Laura again." In college, before Eric, I'd been an avid hiker. There was something about standing on a remote trail, surrounded by ancient trees and the symphony of wilderness that made me feel connected to something larger than myself. So when my childhood friend Melissa Scott suggested a 4-day backpacking trip in the Otter Creek Wilderness, it felt like the universe offering me a lifeline. "It'll be good for you," Melissa said over coffee, her eyes bright with excitement. "Just us girls, like old times." Melissa had always been my adventurous counterpart. While I calculated risks, she leaped into them head first. She'd spent the last 5 years traveling through South America, documenting indigenous plant medicine for her doctoral thesis. She'd returned to the States only 3 months prior, bringing with her stories of shamanic rituals and mysterious jungle encounters. "There's this spot in Otter Creek that I've been wanting to explore," she explained, pulling up a map on her phone. "It's off the main trail system. Not many people venture out there because it's pretty remote." "Is it safe?" I asked, the anxious habits Eric had instilled still lingering. Melissa's laugh was like wind chimes. "Where's the fun if it's completely safe? But yes, I've done all my research. The area is beautiful, and if we stick together, we'll be fine." 2 weeks later, we pulled into the small gravel parking area near the trailhead. The October air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and pine. The forest stretched before us like an ancient cathedral, the trees adorned in brilliant autumn colors. For the first time since signing my divorce papers, I felt something like hope flutter in my chest. We shouldered our packs after checking our supplies one final time. Melissa had insisted on bringing extra provisions. "Always better to have and not need," she'd said, tossing another package of dehydrated meals into her cart during our shopping trip. The first day's hike was invigorating. The main trail wound through groves of towering hemlocks and alongside rushing streams. We spotted deer drinking from a crystal-clear pool and watched a red-tailed hawk soar overhead. By late afternoon, we'd reached the junction where we would leave the marked trail and venture into the less-traveled portion of the wilderness. "This is where it gets interesting," Melissa said, consulting her GPS. "From here, we follow this old logging path for about 3 miles until we reach Yellow Creek." I hesitated, eyeing the overgrown path that seemed to disappear into dense underbrush after only a few yards. "Are you sure about this?" "Absolutely. I've got coordinates for a perfect campsite near the creek. Trust me, it'll be worth it." The path quickly became challenging, with fallen trees blocking our way and thick rhododendron tunnels requiring us to bend double to pass through. But Melissa navigated confidently, checking her GPS occasionally. I followed, trying to ignore the growing unease that seemed to settle over me like a shroud. The forest grew quieter the deeper we ventured. The vibrant bird chatter that had accompanied us earlier faded, until all I could hear was our labored breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath our boots. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving the forest unnaturally still. "Do you notice anything strange?" I asked Melissa as we paused to drink water. She looked around, shrugging. "It's peaceful. That's why I wanted to bring you here. No distractions, just nature." But it wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that eyes followed our every move from the shadowed undergrowth. We reached Yellow Creek as dusk approached. The water ran dark and sluggish between moss-covered banks. Melissa led us upstream for another half-mile before announcing we had reached her chosen campsite. It was a small clearing nestled between ancient oaks, their gnarled branches stretching overhead like arthritic fingers. "Home, sweet home," she said cheerfully, dropping her pack. I tried to match her enthusiasm as we set up camp, but the oppressive silence of the forest only deepened as darkness fell. We built a fire, its orange flames offering little comfort against the encroaching night. The shadows it cast seemed to move with unnatural purpose among the trees. Over a dinner of rehydrated pasta, Melissa shared stories from her time in Peru. "There was this one shaman," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He told me that there are places in the wilderness where the veil between worlds grows thin. Places where entities that aren't quite human can cross over." "That's comforting," I replied, trying to keep my tone light despite the chill that ran down my spine. "He gave me something before I left." Melissa reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, a protection charm. Said I might need it someday. "And you think today's that day?" She didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond our firelight. I've always been sensitive to energies, and there's something different about this place. I wanted to dismiss her words as campfire dramatics, But the oppressive silence of the forest made it impossible. Even the creek seemed to flow without sound, the water moving like black oil in the moonlight. "Let's get some sleep," I suggested, suddenly eager to escape the conversation. "We've got a long hike tomorrow if we want to reach that waterfall you mentioned." We retreated to our separate tents, but sleep eluded me. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent my heart racing. Sometime around midnight, I heard Melissa leave her tent, her footsteps soft on the forest floor. I assumed she was answering nature's call until I realized she wasn't returning. After counting to 300, I unzipped my tent and peered out. The fire had died to embers, casting a faint red glow over our campsite. Melissa's tent flap was open, but there was no sign of her. "Melissa?" I called, my voice sounding small and fragile in the vast silence. No response. I grabbed my headlamp and slipped on my boots, trying to ignore the panic building in my chest. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I moved around our campsite, searching for any sign of my friend. "Melissa, this isn't funny." A twig snapped in the underbrush to my left. I swung my light toward the sound, heart pounding. Nothing but shadows and trees. Another snap, this time behind me. I whirled around, the beam of my headlamp illuminating nothing but empty forest. Then I saw it, a flash of movement at the edge of my light's reach, a figure slipping between trees, moving with unnatural speed. "Melissa!" My voice cracked. I followed, driven by equal parts concern and mounting fear. The figure stayed just ahead of me, visible only as a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. It led me deeper into the forest, away from the safety of our camp. The rational part of my brain screamed warnings, but I couldn't abandon Melissa, not if she was in trouble. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I stumbled into another clearing. My headlamp flickered, the beam weakening despite fresh batteries. In the dying light, I saw Melissa standing in the center of the clearing, her back to me. Relief flooded through me. "Melissa, what the hell are you doing out here?" She didn't respond or turn around. She stood unnaturally still, her arms hanging limp at her sides. "Melissa?" I approached slowly, unease replacing relief. "Are you okay?" When she finally turned, the scream died in my throat. It was Melissa's face, but not her eyes. Her normally warm brown eyes were now milky white, pupilless orbs that reflected my headlamp's fading light like a cat's. Her lips stretched into a smile too wide for her face, revealing teeth that seemed longer, sharper than they should be. "Laura," she said, but the voice wasn't hers. It was older, rasping, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "You shouldn't have followed." I stumbled backward, nearly falling. "What's happening? Melissa, what's wrong with you?" "Melissa invited me in," the thing wearing my friend's face said. "She wanted to know the secrets of this place. I showed her." The smile widened impossibly further. "Would you like to see too?" My headlamp died completely, plunging us into darkness broken only by thin moonlight filtering through the canopy. In that silver illumination, I saw other figures emerging from the trees, elongated shadows with too many joints moving with a jerking, insect-like motion. I ran. Blind with terror, I crashed through underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. Behind me, something pursued, moving with purpose through the forest that was its home. I could hear it breathing, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling. Pain shot up from my ankle as I scrambled to rise. It was sprained, maybe broken. I limped forward, knowing with crushing certainty that I couldn't outrun whatever was behind me. A hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. I lashed out blindly, my fist connecting with something solid. There was a grunt of pain, a human sound, and suddenly light blinded me. "Laura, it's me! Stop!" I blinked against the brightness, Melissa's face swimming into focus. The real Melissa, her eyes normal, filled with concern and confusion. "What the hell are you doing out here? she demanded, keeping her flashlight aimed at the ground now to avoid blinding me further. I woke up and you were gone. You... I couldn't form coherent thoughts. I followed you. You were standing in a clearing. Your eyes... Melissa's expression shifted from concern to alarm. I've been asleep until 10 minutes ago when I heard you screaming. You must have been dreaming. No, I insisted, looking around wildly. We were surrounded by dense forest, no clearing in sight. There was something out here, something pretending to be you. Melissa helped me to my feet, supporting me as I tested my injured ankle. You were sleepwalking, Laura. It happens, especially in unfamiliar environments. Let's get you back to camp. I wanted to believe her explanation, but the memory of those milky eyes and too wide smile was burned into my brain. As we made our slow way back to camp, with Melissa supporting my weight, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that something watched us from just beyond the flashlight's reach. At camp, Melissa helped me into my tent and examined my ankle. It's just a sprain, she declared. We should head back in the morning, though. Get you to a doctor. I'm not crazy, I said, needing her to believe me. Something's wrong with this place. She sighed, her expression softening. I believe that you experienced something frightening. But Laura, you've been under so much stress with the divorce. The mind plays tricks sometimes. I wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was overtaking me. Melissa gave me some ibuprofen from the first aid kit and promised to stay awake and keep watch. Despite my terror, I fell into a fitful sleep. I woke to gray dawn light filtering through my tent fabric and the smell of coffee. My ankle throbbed dully as I crawled from my sleeping bag. Outside, Melissa was already packed, tending to a small breakfast fire. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said, too cheerfully. "How's the ankle?" "Sore, but I can walk." I accepted the cup of instant coffee she offered. "Melissa, about last night—" "Let's talk about it after we get back to civilization," she interrupted. "I want to get an early start. Weather report on my satellite messenger says there's a storm coming in." I looked up at the clear sky, visible in the patches through the canopy. "Seems fine now. Weather changes fast in these mountains." Her tone left no room for argument. We broke camp quickly, and Melissa insisted on taking some of the weight from my pack to ease the burden on my injured ankle. As we started back the way we had come, I noticed her checking her GPS more frequently than she had on our way in, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Something wrong?" I asked after the third time she stopped to verify our position. "Just being careful," she replied without meeting my eyes. By midday, it became clear we were lost. The path we had followed in had seemingly vanished, the forest reconfiguring itself around us. Melissa's GPS showed us moving in circles despite our efforts to maintain a straight course. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, smacking the device against her palm as if that might fix it. "We should have hit the main trail hours ago." The sky darkened rapidly, though it was barely afternoon. The storm Melissa had mentioned was materializing after all, thick clouds rolling in with unnatural speed. "We need to find shelter," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. As if in response, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the forest. The air grew thick with electricity, raising the hair on my arms. The first fat droplets of rain splattered against the leaves overhead. "There," Melissa pointed to what appeared to be a structure among the trees ahead. "Looks like an old cabin or hunting shelter." We hurried toward it as the rain intensified, driven by gusting wind that bent the trees around us. The structure took shape through the curtain of rain, a small, dilapidated cabin with a sagging porch and missing windows. It looked abandoned, perhaps for decades. "Beggars can't be choosers," Melissa said, already climbing the rotting steps. The cabin door hung askew on rusted hinges, opening with a prolonged creak when Melissa pushed it. Inside was a single room, empty save for a collapsed wooden chair and an ancient cast-iron stove in one corner. The air smelled of mold and something else, a sharp animal musk that made my nose wrinkle. "Home, sweet home," Melissa said, echoing her words from the previous night, though this time without the cheerfulness. We spread our emergency blankets on the dusty floor and changed into dry clothes, turning our backs to each other for privacy. The rain hammered against the roof, finding its way through numerous holes to drip onto the floor. Thunder crashed overhead and lightning illuminated the room in strobing flashes. "Do you think it's safe here?" I asked, eyeing the dubious ceiling. "Safer than out there." Melissa unpacked her satellite messenger again, frowning at the screen. "No signal. We'll have to wait out the storm and try to find our way back tomorrow." Night fell early, hastened by the storm clouds. We used our headlamps sparingly, aware that the batteries needed to last. In the confined space of the cabin, with rain drumming overhead and occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the decrepit interior, I found myself studying Melissa's face, searching for any sign that she wasn't herself. "You're staring," she said without looking up from the energy bar she was unwrapping. "Sorry, just thinking." "About last night?" She sighed, finally meeting my gaze. "Look, I believe that you experienced something frightening, but I also think we need to consider rational explanations." "Like sleepwalking? I've never sleepwalked in my life." "Stress can trigger it for the first time. And you've been through a lot." She hesitated. "There's something else you should know. When I was in Peru..." A tremendous crash of thunder cut her off, so loud it seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. In the silence that followed, we heard it, scratching at the door. Soft at first, then more insistent. "Probably just a branch in the wind," Melissa whispered, but she made no move to check. The scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Scratch, scratch, pause. Scratch, scratch, pause. Too regular to be random. Then a voice called from outside, my voice. "Melissa? Laura? Let me in. I'm hurt." We stared at each other, frozen. My mouth was firmly closed, but my voice continued to call from beyond the door. "Please, it's so cold out here. I'm bleeding." Melissa's face drained of color. She fumbled for her pack, hands shaking as she withdrew the leather pouch she'd shown me the night before. "We need to establish a protective boundary," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain and the thing that continued to call with my voice. "The shaman warned me about this." "Warned you about what?" My heart hammered so hard I could barely hear my own words. "Places where the veil is thin, where things can cross over." She opened the pouch, spilling its contents onto her palm, a mixture of dried herbs, small bones, and what looked like teeth. I didn't believe it could be real. The scratching at the door became pounding, the wood flexing inward with each impact. The voice had changed, no longer using my timbre but something deeper, guttural. "Let me in." Melissa worked quickly, creating a circle of the mixture around us, muttering words in a language I didn't understand. Outside, the pounding intensified, and now there were other sounds joining it, scrabbling at the walls and ceiling as if dozens of creatures surrounded the cabin. "What the hell is happening?" I demanded, terror making my voice sharp. "The locals call it the Wendigo," Melissa replied, still focused on completing her circle. "But that's just one name for it. Every culture has stories of hunger spirits that wear human skin." "And you brought us here knowing this?" Rage momentarily overcame my fear. I didn't believe the stories. I thought they were just local superstitions, metaphors for the dangers of wilderness and isolation. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "The shaman gave me this protection charm as a precaution. I never thought we'd need it." The door splintered, a long crack appearing down its center. Through it, I glimpsed something pale and glistening in the lightning flashes. Not quite a hand, with too many joints and elongated fingers ending in curved claws. "Complete the circle," Melissa shouted, tossing me the remaining mixture from her pouch. I scattered it with shaking hands, connecting the gap she had left. The moment the circle closed, a howl of frustration erupted from outside, a sound no human or known animal could make. The pounding on the door stopped abruptly. For several minutes, we huddled together in absolute silence, straining to hear any movement outside over the continuing storm. Finally, Melissa spoke, her voice a bare whisper. "The charm creates a boundary they can't cross, but it won't last forever." "What are they?" The shaman called them the Hungry Ones. Spirits that were once human but have forgotten what humanity means. They hunger for flesh, for memories, for souls. They're most powerful in places like this, remote wilderness where they've been feeding for centuries. "You said they can wear human skin," I said, remembering the thing that had worn Melissa's face the night before. "How do I know you're really you?" She met my gaze steadily. "You don't. And I don't know if you're really you. That's what they do. Sow distrust. Divide us so we're easier to take." Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. The wind howled around the cabin's eaves, a sound too similar to the creature's frustrated wail. Every creak of the old structure, every rattle of the broken windows sent fresh terror through me. "What do we do now?" I asked. "Wait for dawn. They're weaker in daylight." Melissa leaned against the wall, drawing her knees to her chest. "Try to get some sleep. I'll take first watch." "You're insane if you think I can sleep." But exhaustion has its own demands. Despite the terror, despite the sounds that occasionally came from outside, whispers that might have been the wind, scratching that might have been branches, I eventually drifted into uneasy slumber. I awoke with a start, instantly aware that something was wrong. The cabin was silent. The storm apparently passed. Weak, gray light filtered through the broken windows suggesting dawn had arrived, but Melissa was gone. The protective circle remained unbroken, but there was a gap in it near the door, as if someone had carefully swept aside the mixture to create a path out. My pack remained where I'd left it, but Melissa's was gone. "Melissa!" I called, my voice hoarse. The cabin door hung open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. Outside, the forest dripped with lingering rain, the ground muddy and covered in fallen branches from the storm's fury. I limped to the doorway, peering out cautiously. There were footprints in the mud, a single set heading away from the cabin and into the forest. Melissa's size and boot tread. For a long moment, I stood there, paralyzed by indecision. Had Melissa abandoned me? Had something taken her? Or had she simply gone to scout our position in the daylight? I stepped back inside, checking my pack. My GPS was where I'd left it, but the batteries were dead. My satellite phone, which had been in a side pocket, was missing. Fear clawed at my throat. I needed to make a decision, stay and wait for Melissa, or follow her tracks and risk encountering whatever lurked in these woods. The distant crack of a branch breaking decided for me. Something was moving through the forest, coming toward the cabin. I grabbed my pack, wincing as its weight settled on my injured ankle, and slipped out the door, heading in the opposite direction from both the approaching sounds and Melissa's tracks. I moved as quickly and quietly as my injury allowed, using trees for support. The forest was eerily silent in the aftermath of the storm. No birdsong or insect noise to be heard, just the drip of water from leaves and my own labored breathing. After about 15 minutes of steady movement, I paused to check my surroundings and nearly cried with relief. Through the trees ahead, I could make out a wider path, one of the marked trails we'd been seeking. Civilization was within reach. I hurried forward, hope giving new strength to my limbs. As I reached the trail, I heard my name called from behind. "Laura, wait!" I turned to see Melissa emerging from the trees, her face scratched and dirty but unmistakably relieved. "Thank God," she gasped, reaching me and pulling me into a tight hug. "When I woke up and you were gone, I thought they'd taken you." I pushed her away, confusion and anger boiling over. "What are you talking about? You were gone when I woke up." She stared at me, dawning horror in her eyes. "Laura, I never left the cabin. I fell asleep after my watch. When I woke up, the circle was broken, and you were gone. Cold dread pooled in my stomach. If Melissa hadn't left the cabin, whose tracks had I seen? And who, or what, had been coming toward it? "We need to go," I said, grabbing her arm and pulling her along the trail. "Now." We moved as fast as my injury allowed, neither of us speaking until the trail widened further, signs of human presence increasing. A wooden trail marker appeared, then another. The forest began to feel less oppressive, the silence giving way to normal woodland sounds. Finally, exhausted and aching, we reached the parking area where we'd left Melissa's car. It sat exactly as we'd left it, undisturbed. Only then did I release the breath I felt I'd been holding for hours. As Melissa drove us away from Otter Creek Wilderness, I stared out the window at the passing trees, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed us out. That night at the motel, after a hot shower and with my ankle properly wrapped, I finally asked the question that had been haunting me. "What really happened out there, Melissa?" She was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the bedspread. "I don't know for certain, but I think they were testing us, learning about us so they could mimic us better. But why didn't they just kill us? Because that's not what they hunger for most." Her eyes met mine, haunted. They want to become us, to wear our lives like we wear clothes. Death is quick. They prefer to savor. We drove back to civilization the next day, neither of us speaking much about what had happened. Melissa flew back to her research position in Boston a week later. We promised to stay in touch, but our calls became less frequent, our texts more perfunctory. 3 months after our trip, I received a text from Melissa's number. "Coming back to town next week. Would love to catch up. Same coffee shop?" I stared at the message for a long time before responding, looking forward to it. But when I arrived at the coffee shop, I didn't go inside. I watched through the window as someone who looked exactly like Melissa sat at a corner table, checking her watch occasionally. Her movements were slightly off, too fluid, too perfect, and when she smiled at the barista, the expression spread just a fraction too wide. I blocked her number that night and moved to Chicago the following month. I never hike anymore, and I've developed a fear of forests that my new therapist calls an understandable response to trauma. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder about the real Melissa. Did she make it out of those woods? Or is something wearing her face, living her life, slowly forgetting that it was ever anything but human? And sometimes, catching my reflection in a darkened window, I find myself studying my own eyes, searching for any sign that they're not quite right, that something hungry now lives behind them, wearing Laura like a second skin, getting better at the performance with each passing day. After all, the hungrier we are, the better we become at pretending to be full. My name is Robert Johnson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Monongahela National Forest, West Virginia, 2 summers ago. I still have nightmares about it. I needed to get away. The divorce had been finalized 3 months prior, and the emptiness of my apartment was driving me insane. Every corner held memories of Jessica. Her books still missing from the shelves, the faint scent of her perfume somehow lingering in the closet. My therapist suggested a change of scenery, something to reset my mental landscape. That's how I found myself researching solo hiking trips in West Virginia. I'd always been moderately outdoorsy, weekend camping trips with friends in college, the occasional day hike, but nothing extreme. This would be different. 5 days alone in the wilderness of Monongahela National Forest, specifically the remote areas around Seneca Creek. I spent weeks planning my route, gathering supplies, and reading trail guides. The forest called to me through photographs of emerald canopies and crystal streams. It looked peaceful, healing. God, I was such a fool. The drive from Pittsburgh took just over 3 hours. I parked at the Seneca Creek backcountry trailhead, a small gravel lot at the end of a winding forest road. Only 2 other cars were there, a dusty Subaru with Colorado plates and an older pickup truck. I double-checked my pack, secured my hiking poles, and set off around mid-morning. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The June air was warm but not stifling, filtered through a cathedral of towering hemlocks and red spruce. The trail followed Seneca Creek for several miles, the water a clear, cold ribbon beside me. I stopped frequently to photograph moss-covered boulders and tiny wildflowers. For the first time since Jessica had said, "I can't do this anymore," I felt my chest loosen. I made camp that evening in a small clearing about 7 miles in, near where the creek widened into a series of gentle pools. I'd passed only 3 other hikers all day, a retired couple who warned me about a washed-out section ahead, and a solitary guy about my age who nodded without speaking as we crossed paths. The silence felt comforting rather than lonely. As darkness fell, I sat beside my small fire, eating rehydrated beef stew and listening to the creek's constant murmur. Stars emerged between gaps in the trees, brilliant and numerous in a way they never were in the city. I crawled into my tent around 10 and fell into the deepest sleep I'd had in months. I woke to rain pattering on my tent. Nothing unusual, just a summer shower. I made coffee on my portable stove under the rainfly and studied my map. Today's hike would take me deeper into the backcountry, up to Seneca Rocks and then along a less traveled path to a series of hidden waterfalls mentioned in one of the trail guides. The rain stopped by the time I broke camp, but the forest remained draped in mist, lending an ethereal quality to the landscape. The trail grew steeper, narrower. Twice I had to check my GPS to ensure I hadn't strayed from the path. Around noon, I reached a stunning overlook. Seneca Rocks rising dramatically from the valley floor, their quartz-streaked faces gleaming wet in patches of sunlight breaking through the clouds. I was alone up there, perched on the edge of the world. I took a photo to send to Jessica when I got back to civilization, then immediately deleted it. Old habits. The path beyond the overlook descended into a valley I later learned was locally called Witch's Hollow. It wasn't on my official map, but a weathered wooden sign marked the trail junction. The name should have been my first warning, but I was captivated by the beauty of the place. Ferns as tall as my waist, trees so ancient their trunks took 3 people to encircle, and everywhere the sound of water trickling through hidden channels in the earth. I'd gone perhaps 2 miles into the hollow when I first noticed something odd. The bird songs, which had been my constant companions, suddenly ceased. The silence was absolute, save for the sound of my breathing and the soft crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I told myself it was nothing. Birds go quiet sometimes. Maybe a hawk was nearby. Then I saw the cabin. It wasn't marked on any of my maps. Standing in a small clearing choked with high grass and brambles, it appeared ancient. Hand-hewn logs gone silver with age, a sagging porch, roof partially collapsed on one side. I approached cautiously, thinking it might be an old ranger station or trapper's cabin. "Hello?" I called, receiving nothing but forest silence in return. The door hung askew on leather hinges. Inside was a single room, dim despite the afternoon light. A crude table, a chair, a rusted iron stove in one corner. No signs of recent habitation except, and this is what made the hair on my arms stand up, a small bundle of fresh wildflowers in a mason jar on the table. Someone had been here. Recently. I backed out, suddenly anxious to put distance between myself and the cabin. I continued down the trail, checking my GPS frequently. The path was becoming fainter, overgrown in places. I considered turning back, but my planned campsite was supposed to be just a few miles ahead, near one of the waterfalls. That's when I heard it. A voice, distant but clear, calling what sounded like a name. I stopped, listening intently. Nothing. Then again, "Ellie?" A woman's voice, tinged with concern. "Hello," I shouted back. "Is someone there?" No response, but the voice came again, more distant now. "Ellie, where are you, honey?" I left the trail, moving in the direction of the voice. It was stupid, I know that now, but at the time, I thought someone might be in trouble. A lost child, perhaps. I pushed through thick undergrowth for maybe 10 minutes before emerging at the edge of a small pond I hadn't seen on my map. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the trees and cloudy sky like a mirror. On the opposite shore stood a woman in a blue rain jacket, her back to me. "Hello," I called, relieved to see another person. "Are you looking for someone?" She didn't react. I called again, louder, but she remained motionless, staring into the woods beyond the pond. Concerned, I began making my way around the water's edge. I was halfway around when she finally turned. Even from 50 yards away, something seemed wrong with her face. It was blank, not expressionless, but literally lacking distinct features, as if someone had smudged them away. I blinked hard, convinced it was a trick of the light or distance. When I looked again, she was gone. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I scanned the tree line where she'd been standing but saw no movement, no flash of blue among the green. "Hello?" I called once more, my voice sounding small and swallowed by the dense forest. Nothing. I practically ran back to the trail, heart hammering against my ribs. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. Stress, grief playing tricks on your mind. I checked my GPS again. The waterfall campsite was less than a mile ahead. I would make camp, get a good night's sleep, and everything would seem rational in the morning light. The campsite, when I reached it, was perfect. A flat area beside a 30-foot waterfall that cascaded into a deep, clear pool. Any other time, I would have been enchanted. Now, I mechanically went through the motions of setting up my tent, filtering water, preparing dinner. The sun was setting, painting the sky visible through breaks in the canopy with streaks of crimson and gold. As darkness fell, I built a fire more substantial than I needed, the flames a barrier against the gathering shadows. I tried to focus on practical things, checking my supplies, planning tomorrow's route, but my mind kept returning to the woman by the pond, her featureless face. That night, I dreamed of the cabin. In my dream, I was sitting at the crude wooden table while an old woman with long silver hair stirred something in a pot on the stove. She was humming a tuneless melody that made my teeth ache. When she turned to face me, she had the same blank features as the woman by the pond. "You shouldn't be here, Robert," she said, though she had no mouth to speak with. "This hollow doesn't welcome your kind." I woke with a start, drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. Outside my tent, the fire had burned down to embers, and somewhere, not far away, a woman was singing. The melody was the same tuneless hum from my dream, rising and falling without pattern or harmony. I lay frozen, straining my ears. The singing stopped, replaced by the distinct sound of footsteps circling my tent, the soft crunch of pine needles and leaves. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped directly outside the tent wall near my head. I could see a shadow outlined against the nylon, someone standing perfectly still. Then, slowly, a hand pressed against the fabric, the fingers unnaturally long and twisted. I scrambled to the opposite side of the tent, fumbling for my flashlight and knife. When I finally managed to turn the light on and pointed at the tent wall, the shadow was gone. I didn't sleep again that night. Dawn came misty and gray. I broke camp quickly, skipping breakfast in my eagerness to be moving. I decided to abandon my original route and head back the way I'd come. Whatever was happening, hallucinations, an elaborate prank, or something I couldn't begin to comprehend, I wanted out of Witch's Hollow. The trail seemed different in the morning light, narrower with branches reaching across the path like grasping hands. Twice I had to check my GPS to confirm I was heading in the right direction. The forest felt watchful, hostile. I'd been hiking for about an hour when I came across the dog. It was sitting in the middle of the trail, a large German shepherd with a glossy black and tan coat. It watched me approach with intelligent eyes, making no move to run or bark. "Hey there," I said softly, relieved to see something normal. "You lost, buddy?" The dog tilted its head but didn't respond otherwise. No collar that I could see. I squatted down and extended my hand, making soft, clicking noises with my tongue. "Where's your owner, huh?" The dog stood and trotted a few paces down the trail, then looked back at me expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" I laughed nervously. This was straight out of Lassie, but I was glad for the company. I followed as the dog led me down the path. After about 10 minutes, we came to a fork in the trail that I didn't remember from the day before. The dog took the left branch without hesitation. I checked my GPS, which showed no fork at all. According to the device, I was currently standing in the middle of unbroken forest. I hesitated. The right fork seemed to head in the direction I wanted to go, back toward the main trail and eventually the trailhead. But the dog was already disappearing around a bend in the left path, and for some reason I couldn't explain, I felt compelled to follow. The left path descended steeply into a ravine I definitely hadn't seen before. The trees grew denser, blocking much of the morning light, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step. The dog stayed just ahead, occasionally looking back as if to ensure I was still following. We emerged from the trees onto the shore of a lake. Not the small pond from yesterday. This was much larger, its far shore barely visible through the mist that hovered over the water. And there, at the edge of the lake, was a small community of cabins, perhaps a dozen structures of varying sizes, all built from the same weathered logs as the solitary cabin I'd found. The dog trotted toward the nearest cabin and scratched at the door. "Hello," I called, approaching cautiously. "Anyone home?" The door creaked open and a man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in clothes that seemed strangely old-fashioned. Canvas pants, a flannel shirt worn thin at the elbows, boots that had been repaired multiple times. His beard was streaked with gray, his eyes deep-set beneath a furrowed brow. "You're off the path," he said, not accusatory, just stating a fact. I think I'm lost," I admitted. "Your dog led me here." The man looked down at the German shepherd, which was now sitting obediently at his side. "Isn't my dog," he said. "Thought he was with you." A chill ran through me. "No, I found him on the trail. He led me here." The man studied me for a long moment. "Name's Elias Harper," he finally said. "You better come inside. Not safe to be wandering these parts without knowing the way." Every instinct told me to run, to find my way back to the main trail and civilization, but I was lost. My GPS was useless, and the mist was growing thicker by the minute. I followed Elias into the cabin. Inside was surprisingly cozy. A fire burned in a stone hearth. The walls were lined with books and handmade furniture, and the single room was clean and well organized. It smelled of wood smoke, herbs, and something baking. "Sit," Elias gestured to a chair by the fire. "Tea?" I nodded, sinking into the chair. The dog curled up at my feet as if it had known me forever. "Where am I?" I asked. "This place isn't on any map." "No, it wouldn't be," Elias agreed, putting a kettle on the wood stove. "Hollow folk prefer it that way." "Hollow folk?" "Those of us who live in Witch's Hollow. Been here for generations, most families." I took out my phone, unsurprised to find no signal. "I need to get back to the main trail. I'm supposed to hike out today." Elias handed me a mug of tea that smelled of mint and something else, something unfamiliar. "Drink this. Good for clearing the head. We'll talk about getting you back after." The tea was sweet and tasted of forest things. Mint, yes, but also berries and honey and something earthy underneath. As I drank, warmth spread through my limbs and the fog of fear that had gripped me since the previous day began to lift. "Better?" Elias asked. I nodded. "Thank you. I've been seeing things, I think. A woman with no face. Someone outside my tent last night." Elias's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. "What else?" I told him everything. The cabin with fresh flowers, the voice calling for Ellie, the humming in the night. With each detail, his face grew graver. "The widow," he said when I'd finished. "She's found you interesting." "The widow." Elias sighed and poked at the fire. "Every place has its stories, its guardians. The widow watches over the hollow, has for as long as anyone can remember. Most times she leaves folks be. Sometimes, though, she takes an interest." "What does that mean?" I asked, a fresh wave of unease washing over me. "Means you've been marked," came a voice from the doorway. I turned to see an elderly woman entering the cabin. She moved with surprising grace for her age. Her silver hair braided and wrapped around her head like a crown. The dog rose and went to her, pressing against her leg affectionately. "This is my mother, Ida Harper," Elias said. "You've been dream-walking with the widow," Ida said, fixing me with pale blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. "She's lonely, looking for company." "I don't understand," I said. Ida settled into a chair opposite mine, the dog lying at her feet. "The story goes that she lost her husband and child to the lake many years ago, drowned in the mist. She's been searching ever since, calling for her daughter, looking for her husband in the faces of men who passed through. The woman by the pond was calling for Ellie," I remembered. Ida nodded. "Her daughter's name, Eloise. But her face, she has no face because she's forgotten what she looks like," Elias interjected. "Been too long." I set down my mug, my hands suddenly shaking. "This is crazy. Ghosts aren't real." Ida smiled sadly. "In the hollow, the line between what's real and what isn't gets mighty thin, especially for those who are already haunted." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" "You came here carrying grief," she said simply. "The widow smells it on you. Calls to her, like to like. I thought of Jessica, of the emptiness in my apartment, of the void that had opened inside me when she left. So what happens now? What does she want from me?" Elias and Ida exchanged glances. It was Elias who finally spoke. "If you stay in the hollow, she'll keep coming for you. In dreams at first, then waking. She'll try to make you like her, faceless, lost in grief forever. How do I stop her?" "You need to leave the hollow before nightfall," Ida said firmly. "And you need to let go of whatever grief you're carrying. Not all at once. That's not how healing works. But you need to start." "I'll show you the way back," Elias offered. "But first, Mother needs to prepare you." Ida rose and went to a cabinet, returning with a small cloth pouch. "Iron filings and salt," she explained, hanging it around my neck on a leather cord. "And this," she pressed something cold and metal into my palm, "was my husband's. Silver. The widow fears it." I looked down at a silver pocket knife, tarnished with age but beautiful in its craftsmanship. "I can't take this." "You'll return it," Ida said with certainty. "When you're ready, you'll find your way back to us." Elias gave me supplies, water, some bread and dried meat, and we set out shortly after noon. The dog came with us, leading the way through paths invisible to my eye. We walked in silence for the most part, the mist growing thinner as we climbed out of the ravine. After about an hour, Elias stopped. "Main trail's just ahead. Follow it north," he pointed, "and you'll reach the trailhead in about 4 hours if you keep a good pace." "Thank you," I said, "for everything. I still don't understand what happened." "Some things aren't for understanding," Elias replied, "just for experiencing and then letting go." He patted the dog's head. "Scout will see you to the main trail." "The dog has a name?" I asked. "I thought you said he wasn't yours." A ghost of a smile crossed Elias's weathered face. "He belongs to the hollow. Helps lost souls find their way, one way or another." With that cryptic statement, Elias turned and disappeared into the trees with surprising speed. Within seconds, it was as if he'd never been there at all. Scout nudged my hand with his nose, then trotted ahead. I followed, fingering the silver knife in my pocket, the pouch of iron and salt heavy against my chest. We reached the main trail exactly where Elias had said we would. I recognized it immediately. This was the same path I'd taken 2 days ago, though it seemed like weeks had passed. Scout sat watching me expectantly. "Thank you," I told him, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking to a dog. "Will you find your way home?" Scout's only response was to stand and lope off in the direction we'd come, quickly vanishing into the underbrush. I checked my GPS, which was working again, and began hiking north. The forest around me seemed normal now. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, the occasional rustling as some small creature moved through the underbrush. I walked quickly, determined to reach my car before dark. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail, when I heard it again, the tuneless humming from my dream. I froze, scanning the trees around me. Nothing. "Leave me alone," I said aloud. "I'm leaving your hollow. I'm not who you're looking for." The humming stopped. For a moment, all was silent. Then a voice, the same one I'd heard calling for Ellie, spoke directly behind me. "Everyone leaves," it said, the words thick with sadness. "Everyone always leaves." I didn't turn around. Couldn't. The voice was so close I could feel cold breath on the back of my neck. "I know about loss," I said, my own voice barely above a whisper. "I understand what it is to be left behind. But this isn't the way. You have to let go." A hand touched my shoulder. Icy cold, the fingers unnaturally long. I clutched the silver knife in my pocket. "Show me your face," the voice demanded. Slowly, I turned. She stood before me, a woman in a blue rain jacket, her face a blank canvas, smooth as stone where features should have been. Only her mouth was visible, a dark gash that opened and closed as she spoke. "You could stay," she said. "Keep me company. I get so lonely here." I withdrew the knife from my pocket, holding it between us. The silver gleamed in the fading light. "I can't stay," I said, "and you can't have me." She recoiled from the knife, her body seeming to flicker like a bad television signal. "Everyone leaves," she repeated, her voice distorting, multiplying into many voices speaking in unison. "Go find peace," I told her, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "Your husband, your daughter, they wouldn't want this for you. They'd want you to let go." The widow let out a wail that seemed to shake the very air. Trees swayed, leaves scattered in a sudden wind. The sound was pure anguish, centuries of loneliness and grief compressed into a single, terrible cry. Then she was gone. Just gone. The forest returned to normal around me, birds resuming their evening songs as if nothing had happened. I ran the rest of the way to the trailhead, not slowing until my car came into view in the small gravel lot. It was the only vehicle left. I threw my pack in the trunk, started the engine, and drove away from Monongahela National Forest as fast as the winding roads would allow. I didn't stop until I reached a motel in Petersburg, nearly an hour away. Only when I was safely locked in my room did I examine the silver knife Ida had given me. In the harsh fluorescent light, I could make out an engraving on the handle, initials, E.W. Eloise Widow. It's been 2 years since my encounter in Witch's Hollow. I've never returned to Monongahela, though I've thought about it often, about Elias and Ida, about Scout, about the community by the misty lake that appears on no map. The knife sits on my desk as I write this, a reminder of what happened and what almost happened. Sometimes, on lonely nights when the grief threatens to overwhelm me again, I think I hear humming, that same tuneless melody echoing through my apartment. But I've learned to let go. Not all at once, as Ida said, that's not how healing works, but day by day, piece by piece, and sometimes, in my dreams, I see Scout sitting at the entrance to a path I can't quite make out, waiting patiently for another lost soul who needs finding. Maybe someday I'll follow him back to the hollow. Not because I'm lost anymore, but because I've found my way. My name is Rachel Rogers, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the autumn of 2023, during what was supposed to be a rejuvenating hiking trip through the Appalachian wilderness of West Virginia. I've always been drawn to solitude. The therapist I'd been seeing for the past year after my divorce said it was a trauma response, this need to disconnect, to find spaces where human voices didn't reach. Maybe she was right. After 15 years with Mark, the silence of an empty apartment was both terrifying and intoxicating. I needed more of it. Cleaner silence. The kind you can only find when civilization drops away completely. That's why I chose the remote trails near Seneca Rocks in West Virginia's Monongahela National Forest. Not the main tourist paths, but the lesser-known routes that local forums mentioned in hushed digital tones. Places where the mountains folded into themselves like ancient creatures sleeping, where the forest grew dense enough to swallow sunlight whole. The weather forecast promised clear skies for my 5-day solo trek. I packed light but thorough. My new ultralight tent, sleeping bag rated for below freezing temperatures, water filtration system, first aid kit, emergency beacon, and enough dehydrated meals to last the duration. My phone was fully charged, loaded with offline maps of the area. I'd even bought a small canister of bear spray, though black bears rarely bothered humans in these parts. The trailhead parking lot was empty when I arrived early Thursday morning. A weathered sign marked the beginning of the Hollow Creek Trail. The wood splintered at the edges. The painted letters faded to ghostly suggestions of themselves. A smaller sign beneath it warned, "Primitive Trail. Experienced hikers only." Perfect. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through stands of ancient hemlocks, their trunks massive and imposing, their canopy creating a perpetual twilight below. Autumn had painted the surrounding hardwoods in blazing oranges and deep reds. The air smelled of decomposing leaves and rain-soaked earth. I hiked until my legs burned pleasantly, until the outside world and all its complications felt like a dream I'd once had. I made camp that night in a small clearing about 8 miles in. As I worked on setting up my tent, I noticed carved symbols on several trees surrounding the clearing. Crude things that looked like stick figures with too many limbs, or perhaps misshapen stars. Probably just bored teenagers, I thought, though a voice in the back of my mind wondered how teenagers would get this far into the wilderness just to carve nonsense into trees. That first night, I slept deeply, wrapped in the endless symphony of the forest, the distant hooting of owls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the trees. I dreamed of floating through the canopy, looking down at my sleeping body below, a tiny, insignificant thing in the vastness of the wilderness. I woke to a perfect dawn, mist curling through the trees like reluctant ghosts. As I heated water for coffee on my tiny camp stove, I caught movement at the edge of the clearing. A deer, I thought initially, but when I looked directly at it, I saw it was a dog, a large, wolfish-looking animal with a thick gray coat. It stood motionless, watching me from between two hemlocks. "Hey there," I called softly, wondering if it belonged to another hiker, though I'd seen no one else on the trail. The dog didn't move, didn't wag its tail or bark. It just watched me with unblinking yellow eyes. I dug into my pack and found a protein bar, unwrapped it, and tossed half of it toward the animal. "You hungry, buddy?" The dog didn't approach the food. After several long moments of this strange standoff, it simply turned and melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. I finished my breakfast, packed up camp, and continued deeper into the wilderness. The trail grew less distinct, requiring me to check my map more frequently. By midday, I'd reached a section where the path crossed a stream multiple times. The water ran clear and cold over smooth, dark stones. I filled my bottle and dropped in a purification tablet, then sat on a fallen log to eat lunch. That's when I first heard the whispering. At first, I thought it was just the water moving over rocks, or perhaps the wind through the leaves above, but as I strained to listen, I realized it sounded almost like words, just below the threshold of comprehension. I turned in a slow circle, searching for the source, but I was utterly alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the vastness. The whispering stopped immediately. The forest fell into a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Even the stream seemed to quiet its babbling. I stood perfectly still, the hair on my arms rising despite the warm afternoon sun filtering through the canopy. After what felt like minutes, a single bird called out from somewhere nearby, breaking the spell. The normal sounds of the forest gradually returned, and I laughed nervously at myself. The isolation was getting to me sooner than expected, making me imagine things. I shouldered my pack and continued hiking, determined to reach my planned campsite before dusk. The trail climbed steadily through the afternoon, growing steeper as it wound up the flank of a mountain. The trees thinned somewhat, allowing glimpses of the vast, rolling landscape beyond, endless waves of forest-covered mountains receding into blue haze at the horizon. By late afternoon, I reached a ridgeline where the trail leveled out, offering spectacular views to the east and west. According to my map, there should be a primitive campsite somewhere along this ridge, near a natural rock outcropping called Devil's Pulpit. As the name came into my mind, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. I'd chosen this route precisely because of landmarks with names like that. They promised adventure, a brush with the wild unknown. Now, miles from civilization with the sun sinking toward the horizon, those names felt less like romantic notions and more like warnings. I found the rock formation just as dusk was settling in, a jagged thrust of dark stone that jutted from the mountainside like the prow of a sinking ship. Below it, a small flat area showed signs of previous campers, a crude fire ring made of stones, tamped down earth where tents had stood. I set up my tent, collected some firewood, and soon had a small, cheerful blaze going. As darkness fell completely, the forest transformed. The familiar shapes of trees dissolved into a wall of impenetrable shadow beyond the firelight. The stars emerged overhead in dizzying profusion where the canopy opened up, a spray of diamond dust across black velvet. I heated a pouch of dehydrated beef stew, ate it while watching the hypnotic dance of the flames, and then prepared for sleep. Just as I was about to climb into my tent, I noticed something odd. The symbols I'd seen carved into trees at my previous campsite. They were here too, etched into the stone face of Devil's Pulpit. They looked older here, weathered by countless seasons, but unmistakably the same design. Those strange, multi-limbed stick figures arranged in a pattern that seemed almost like writing. A coincidence, I told myself, but one that planted a seed of unease in my mind. I took a photo of the carvings with my phone, then retreated into the safety of my tent, zipping the door closed behind me. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every crack of a twig in the darkness jolted me awake. Twice I thought I heard that whispering again. Soft, insistent voices just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. And sometime in the deepest part of the night, I woke to the distinct sensation of being watched. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, listening. The fire had died to embers hours ago, leaving only darkness. Outside, something moved around my campsite. Not the familiar sounds of forest creatures. This was heavier, deliberate, the slow crunch of careful footsteps circling my tent. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for my headlamp and the bear spray I kept beside my sleeping pad. The footsteps completed a full circle around my tent, then stopped directly in front of the door. I could see the shadow of something large blocking the faint starlight that filtered through the nylon. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to make my voice sound authoritative despite my terror. No answer came, but I could hear breathing now. Deep, ragged breaths that didn't sound entirely human. My fingers fumbled with the bear spray, ready to deploy it the instant whatever was out there tried to enter my tent. Minutes passed in this frozen tableau. Then, so suddenly it made me gasp, the shadow moved away. I heard receding footsteps, the crack of branches, and then silence returned to the forest. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally came, I emerged from my tent cautiously, bear spray still clutched in my hand. The campsite appeared undisturbed, my backpack where I'd left it hanging from a tree branch, the fire ring cold and innocuous. The only difference was a set of tracks in the soft earth around my tent, large canine prints that I initially took to be from the dog I'd seen yesterday. But these were different somehow, larger with claw marks that dug deeply into the soil, and they only circled my tent once before leading away into the underbrush, exactly matching the pattern of footsteps I'd heard in the night. I should have turned back then. Every instinct screamed at me to return to civilization, to lights and people and the comforting hum of human activity. But some stubborn part of me refused to have my adventure cut short by what was probably just an overly curious wolf or coyote. Besides, I reasoned, I was already 2 days in. It would take just as long to go back as to complete my planned route. I packed up camp quickly and consulted my map. Today's hike would take me down from the ridge into an area called Harper's Hollow, named after an early settler family who'd mysteriously abandoned their homestead in the 1800s. Another quaint, ominous local name that now set my teeth on edge. According to the map, there were ruins of the Harper cabin somewhere in the hollow, though they weren't marked as a designated historical site. The descent from the ridge was steep and treacherous in places, requiring careful navigation over loose shale and exposed roots. The forest grew denser as I lost elevation, the trees pressing closer together, blocking more of the sky. By midday, the trail had become little more than a game path, winding between massive old-growth trees draped with curtains of moss. The temperature dropped noticeably as I entered Harper's Hollow proper, a long, narrow valley carved by a small stream. The sunlight barely penetrated here, filtered through layers of leaves to cast everything in a sickly green glow. The air felt heavy, almost thick enough to touch, carrying the sweet rot smell of decay. I paused to check my position on the GPS app. According to the map, I should be nearing the site of the old Harper homestead. As I stood there, I became aware of an odd quality to the silence around me. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. That's when I heard it again, the whispering. Closer now, more distinct, though still maddeningly just beyond comprehension. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, rising and falling like waves against a shore. I spun around, searching for the source, my heart rate accelerating. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" My voice fell flat in the dense air, absorbed by the moss and the loam and the listening trees. The whispering stopped for a moment, then resumed, louder now, almost taunting. Fighting rising panic, I forced myself to breathe slowly and think rationally. There had to be a natural explanation. Perhaps it was water moving through underground caverns beneath my feet, or some peculiar acoustic effect of the hollow's shape. I decided to continue toward the Harper ruins. At least there I might find a proper clearing where I could reorient myself. I hadn't gone more than 100 yards when I found them, the crumbling stone foundation of what must have been a modest cabin, half reclaimed by the forest floor. A collapsed chimney stood at one end like a broken tombstone. Around the perimeter, I could make out the rotted remains of a fence or wall, now just a series of decaying posts protruding from the earth. But what caught my attention were the trees surrounding the ruins. Every one of them, dozens in all, bore those same carved symbols I'd seen at my camping spots. Here, they were everywhere, etched into bark at eye level, higher up on trunks, even carved into exposed roots. Some looked ancient, the trees having grown around them over decades. Others appeared more recent, the exposed wood still pale against the dark bark. In the center of the foundation stood a single object that was clearly not part of the original structure, a crude wooden statue about 4 feet tall. It resembled a human figure but with too many limbs arranged at impossible angles, its featureless head tilted as if observing me. It looked weathered and old, covered in patches of pale green lichen, but something about it suggested it wasn't as ancient as it was meant to appear. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, my phone chimed with an alert. Low battery. Impossible. I'd charged it fully before starting my hike, and I'd been careful about using it sparingly, keeping it in airplane mode except when checking my position. Even with heavy use, it should have lasted the entire trip, yet the indicator showed less than 15% remaining. I pulled out my portable charger, only to find it completely drained as well, though I hadn't used it once. A cold weight settled in my stomach as I realized my emergency beacon would likely be affected too. Sure enough, when I tried to power it on, nothing happened. The whispering rose around me again, louder than before. This time, I could almost make out words in the susurration. My name, perhaps, or phrases just familiar enough to snag at the edges of comprehension. The air seemed to thicken further, making each breath an effort. The green-tinted light took on a pulsing quality, as though the whole forest were a living thing with a single, massive heartbeat. I backed away from the statue, nearly tripping over a fallen branch. That's when I noticed the ground around the foundation. It was covered with small animal bones, hundreds of them, forming a grisly carpet that crunched beneath my boots. Most appeared to be from rodents and birds, but some larger ones could have belonged to raccoons or foxes. Terror finally overcame curiosity. I turned to flee back the way I'd come, but stopped short after just a few steps. Standing on the path, blocking my escape, was the dog I'd seen the previous morning. Except in the strange green light of Harper's Hollow, it didn't look like a dog at all. Its proportions were wrong. Legs too long, back oddly hunched, head too large for its body. And its eyes. Its eyes were not animal eyes at all, but disturbingly human-looking, intelligent and aware in a way that sent ice through my veins. It stood perfectly still, watching me with those incongruous eyes, its mouth slightly open to reveal teeth that seemed too numerous and sharp. "Nice dog," I whispered foolishly, as if it were a normal animal that might respond to a friendly tone. "Good boy. I'm just going to go now, okay?" The creature tilted its head at the sound of my voice, an unsettlingly human gesture. Then it did something that stopped my heart for a beat. It smiled. Not the panting, tongue-lolling expression that might pass for a smile on a normal dog, but an actual human smile that stretched its muzzle in an impossible way, revealing even more of those needle-like teeth. I backed away slowly, moving toward the other side of the clearing, never taking my eyes off the creature. It made no move to follow, just watched me with that terrible smile. When I reached what seemed to be another game trail leading away from the ruins, I turned and ran, crashing through underbrush. No longer caring about the noise I made or the direction I was heading. I just needed to get away from that place, from those eyes, from that smile. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to buckle, then slowed to a jog, and finally to a stumbling walk. The forest around me looked unfamiliar, darker, older somehow, the trees growing closer together than seemed natural. I had no idea which direction would lead me back to marked trails, and with my phone nearly dead, I couldn't risk using the GPS again unless absolutely necessary. As the initial surge of adrenaline faded, more rational thoughts began to reassert themselves. I needed to find water, make camp before nightfall, and come up with a plan. The sun, barely visible through the dense canopy, appeared to be getting low. I had perhaps 2 hours of daylight left. I chose a direction that seemed to lead slightly uphill, hoping to eventually reach higher ground where I might get a better view of my surroundings, or possibly even cell service. The going was difficult. No trail to follow, just endless trees and undergrowth that seemed to intentionally tangle around my ankles with every step. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, I came upon a small stream cutting through the forest floor. The water ran clear and cold, and I gratefully refilled my bottles, adding purification tablets even though the water looked pristine. As I knelt by the stream bed, I noticed something half buried in the mud, a small leather-bound book, its pages swollen with moisture. Curiosity overcoming caution, I pulled it free and carefully opened it. Most of the pages were illegible, the ink having run or faded with exposure to the elements. But a few entries remained readable, written in a spidery, antique hand. April 12th, 1879. They are in the woods again tonight. Elizabeth says she hears them calling her name. James thinks it's just wolves, but we know better. The children are frightened. I've carved the signs on more trees as Widow Blackwood instructed, but I fear they are not working as they should. Something has followed us from Harper's Hollow. April 15th, 1879. James saw it today, finally, standing at the edge of the field as he plowed, just watching. Not a wolf, he says now, not anything he can name. Elizabeth won't speak anymore, just rocks by the fire and hums that tune, the one we heard from the hollow. The final legible entry was dated April the 20th, 1879. They took Thomas last night, just 7 years old. We found only his shoes by the fence, placed neatly side by side, pointing toward the hollow. James has gone after them with his rifle, though I begged him not to. The signs are everywhere now, carved into our door, our furniture, appearing on our skin when we wake like strange bruises. Elizabeth says they whisper promises to her at night. She says Thomas is waiting for us. She says he likes his new family better. God help us all. I dropped the book as if it had burned me, my hands shaking violently. This had to be some kind of sick joke, a prop left by locals to scare hikers, or maybe by those same teenagers who'd carved the symbols. But a cold certainty in my gut told me the book was genuine, a relic from some long-forgotten tragedy that had unfolded in these woods. The light was fading rapidly now. I needed to make camp, but the thought of spending another night in these woods filled me with dread. Yet I had little choice. I was hopelessly lost, my electronic devices failing and darkness fast approaching. I found a small clearing near the stream and mechanically went through the motions of setting up my tent, though I doubted I would sleep at all. I didn't attempt to make a fire. Some instinct told me that light would only draw attention in this place, attention I desperately wanted to avoid. Instead, I crawled into my tent as the last gray light drained from the forest, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and clutched my useless phone and the bear spray like talismans against the gathering dark. The whispering started again as soon as full darkness fell. Closer now, more insistent, rising and falling in patterns that almost resembled conversation. Mixed with it were other sounds, the crack of twigs, the rustle of movement through underbrush, and occasionally, something that sounded horribly like distant laughter. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, every muscle tensed, listening to the nightmare sounds of Harper's Hollow by night. Hours crawled by, marked only by the steadily increasing intensity of the whispers and my own thundering heartbeat. At some point, exhaustion must have overcome terror, because I fell into a fitful doze. I dreamed of running through endless trees, pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel at my heels. I dreamed of the wooden statue from the ruins, except it was alive, its too many limbs moving in hypnotic patterns as it danced under a moonless sky. I dreamed of a circle of pale figures standing around my tent, their features indistinct except for their eyes and their smiles. Human eyes and human smiles on bodies that had never been human at all. I woke to silence and gray pre-dawn light filtering through the tent fabric. For a moment, I thought perhaps the worst was over, that whatever strangeness had gripped these woods might recede with the night. Then I became aware of a presence inside my tent. Someone, something, was lying in the sleeping bag beside me. I could feel its weight, hear the soft whisper of its breathing. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to leap up and run, I turned my head to look at my unexpected companion. It was a child. A boy of perhaps 7 or 8, with pale blonde hair and skin so white it was nearly translucent. He wore old-fashioned clothes, a rough linen shirt, wool trousers, and suspenders, all in an advanced state of decay, as if he'd been buried in them for decades. His eyes were closed, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. Thomas, my mind supplied unbidden, the boy from the diary. As if hearing my thought, the child's eyes snapped open. They were milky white without iris or pupil, yet somehow I knew he could see me perfectly. His lips curled into a smile identical to the one I'd seen on the Knot Dog's face. Too wide, too knowing for a child. "You came," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. "Everyone comes to Harper's Hollow eventually, but not everyone gets to leave." I screamed then, a primal sound torn from someplace deeper than thought. I thrashed my way out of the sleeping bag, clawing at the tent zipper with fingers gone numb with terror. Behind me, the boy laughed, a high, sweet sound that might have been charming in any other context, but here was the most horrifying thing I'd ever heard. I burst from the tent into the misty dawn, ready to run blindly in any direction that led away from that laughter. But I stopped short, my scream dying in my throat. I was no longer in the small clearing where I'd made camp. My tent stood in the center of the Harper ruins, its bright modern nylon garish against the weathered stone and ancient trees. And surrounding the ruins, standing in a perfect circle among the symbol-carved trees, were figures. At first glance, they appeared to be people, perhaps a dozen men, women, and children, dressed in the rough clothing of another century. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw that they weren't people at all, at least not anymore. Their proportions were subtly wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Limbs too long or oddly jointed, torsos twisted at impossible angles, heads that moved independently of their necks. And their faces. Their faces were mostly smooth expanses of pale flesh, with only suggestions of features, as if they were sculptures left unfinished by an artist who had only the vaguest idea of human appearance. Except for their eyes and mouths. Those were perfectly, horribly human. They stood motionless, watching me with a collective hunger that was palpable in the chill morning air. Among them, I recognized the Knot Dog from before, except now it stood upright on its hind legs, its front paws elongated into something like hands. Beside it was a woman, or something wearing the approximate shape of a woman, her body bent backward at the waist at an angle that would snap a human spine, her head twisted around to keep those human eyes fixed on me. "We've been waiting for you, Rachel." The boy's voice came from behind me inside my tent. "We've been so lonely since the Harpers left. But now you're here. Now you can join our family." I backed away, though there was nowhere to run, no gap in their circle. My back pressed against the wooden statue at the center of the ruins. Except it wasn't a statue anymore. I could feel it moving against me, those too many limbs starting to curl around my body like the tentacles of some ancient sea creature. "No," I whispered, then louder, "No!" I tore free from the grasping limbs of the statue, clawing at my belt for the bear spray. With a cry that contained all my fear and desperation, I aimed it at the nearest figure, the twisted woman, and pressed the trigger. The spray shot out in a wide cone, directly into her face. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she screamed, a sound no human throat could produce, high and piercing enough to make my eardrums throb. She fell to her knees, clawing at her face with those elongated, not quite human hands. The others moved then, converging on me with a speed that belied their awkward forms. I sprayed wildly, catching 2 more of them before the canister was empty. They reacted just as violently as the first, their screams joining hers in a terrible chorus that seemed to shake the very trees around us. The rest hesitated, creating a momentary gap in their circle. I ran. Blind with terror, with no thought beyond escape, I plunged through the gap and into the forest beyond. Behind me, I heard them recovering, heard the first sounds of pursuit, crashing undergrowth, those inhuman screams transforming into something like excitement, like the baying of hounds on a scent. I ran as I had never run before, my lungs burning, my legs moving automatically over roots and rocks. The forest blurred around me, trees seeming to shift and move in my peripheral vision. The whispering rose to a crescendo in my ears, now clearly forming words. Stay, play, forever, family, stay, never leave. How long I ran, I couldn't say. Time seemed to distort, stretching and compressing like taffy pulled too thin. At times, I felt as if I'd been running for hours. At others, it seemed only seconds had passed since I'd fled the ruins. The light never changed, locked in that eerie pre-dawn grayness that made shadows of everything. Eventually, my body betrayed me. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, tumbling down a short, steep embankment to land in a shallow stream. The shock of the cold water momentarily cleared my panic-fogged mind. I lay there, half submerged, listening for sounds of pursuit. Nothing. Just the gentle gurgle of the stream and the faint rustle of leaves overhead. The whispering had stopped too, leaving a silence that felt almost as unnatural as the voices had been. Slowly, wincing at the pain from what felt like a dozen new bruises, I pulled myself to a sitting position in the stream. My pack was gone, lost somewhere in my headlong flight. All I had were the clothes on my back, my now-dead phone still somehow clutched in one hand, and the empty canister of bear spray still attached to my belt. I needed to get my bearings, to find my way out of this nightmare forest. Squinting up at the sky visible through breaks in the canopy, I tried to determine the position of the sun. It seemed to be climbing toward midday, which would put east. I hesitated, frowning. The sun seemed to be in the wrong place entirely, unless I'd somehow been running in circles. A splash upstream made me freeze. Standing in the water, perhaps 50 yards away, was the boy, Thomas. He wasn't smiling now. His milky eyes regarded me with an expression that might have been sadness on a human child. "You hurt them," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the water. "They only wanted to welcome you." "Stay away from me," I warned, though I had nothing to threaten him with. "I just want to leave. I won't tell anyone about whatever you are." The boy tilted his head, that unsettlingly adult gesture again. "But you can't leave, Rachel. No one leaves Harper's Hollow. Not really." "Watch me," I snarled, finding anger was easier to hold on to than fear. I stood up, water streaming from my clothes, and began walking downstream, away from the boy. If I followed the water, I reasoned, it would eventually lead to larger streams, perhaps even to civilization. "We'll be waiting when you come back," Thomas called after me, his child's voice incongruously cheerful. "We always wait. That's what family does." I didn't look back, just kept moving downstream as fast as the slippery rocks would allow. Hour after hour, I followed the water's path as it wound through the forest, growing gradually wider and deeper. The sun moved overhead, then began its descent toward the western horizon. My clothes dried slowly in the mild air. My stomach growled with hunger, but still I pushed on. As dusk approached, the stream emptied into a larger creek, its banks wider and better defined. And there, incredible as it seemed, was a trail, an actual marked hiking path running alongside the water. Relief made my knees weak. I'd found my way back to the established trails. Civilization couldn't be far now. I chose a direction arbitrarily. Downstream seemed more likely to lead to roads or towns, and began walking with renewed purpose. The trail was well maintained here, with occasional blazes on trees marking the route. As the light faded, I began to worry about spending another night in the open, but anything would be better than the horrors I'd fled. Just as full darkness settled in, I rounded a bend in the trail and saw, gloriously, impossibly, the distant glow of electric lights through the trees. Sobbing with relief, I broke into a stumbling run toward the promise of human habitation. The trail emerged from the forest at a small roadside picnic area. A single streetlight illuminated a concrete table and the gravel parking lot beyond, where a pickup truck was parked. A man sat at the table, the ember of a cigarette glowing red in the gathering darkness. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking with emotion. "Please, I need help. I've been lost in the woods for days." The man startled, then stood up. He was middle-aged with a beard and a flannel shirt, the very picture of a rural West Virginian. "Good Lord, lady, you scared the daylights out of me," he said, but his tone was concerned rather than angry. "You okay? You look like you've been through hell." I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a barely coherent stream. The strange dog, the ruins, the whispering, the boy named Thomas, the not-quite-human figures in the woods. Even as I spoke, I could see the man's expression shifting from concern to skepticism to something like fear. When I finally ran out of words, he was silent for a long moment. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "there ain't no place called Harper's Hollow around here. Nearest settlement was a mining town called Harper's Creek, but that's been abandoned since the 30s, good 20 miles north of here." "But the ruins," I insisted. "The old cabin foundation, it was real. I saw it." He took a step back, his hand moving unconsciously to rest on the knife at his belt. "Listen, you need help, that's clear enough. I can drive you into Davis. There's a clinic there." "I'm not crazy," I interrupted, "and I don't need a clinic. I just need to get home." Tears threatened again, born of frustration and lingering terror. "Please, just help me get to a phone, or somewhere I can charge mine." Perhaps it was the genuine desperation in my voice, or simply human kindness, but the man relented. All right, I'll drive you into town. You can use my phone in the truck if you want." The drive to Davis took about 40 minutes along winding mountain roads. The man, who introduced himself as Jim Beckley, mostly kept a wary silence, though he did give me his phone to call a friend who agreed to wire money for a hotel room and a bus ticket home. It was nearly midnight when Jim dropped me at a small motel on the outskirts of Davis. The night clerk gave me an odd look as I checked in with my muddy clothes and wild eyes, but asked no questions. I thanked Jim profusely for his help. He nodded awkwardly, still clearly unsure what to make of my story. "Just one thing," he said as he was leaving. "You said you found some kind of old diary? Mentioned a Widow Blackwood?" I nodded, surprised he'd latched onto that detail. My granny used to tell stories about a woman by that name. Supposedly, she was a witch who lived around these parts in the 1800s. Used to make deals with things that ain't human. At least, that's how the stories went. He shrugged, embarrassed. "Just old mountain folklore, you know. But maybe don't go hiking alone in these woods anymore, all the same." With that parting advice, he left me to the blessed normality of the motel room with its harsh fluorescent lighting and scratchy polyester bedspread. I showered for what felt like hours, trying to wash away the memory of Harper's Hollow along with the dirt of the forest. Sleep, when it finally came, was deep and dreamless. I woke to late morning sunlight streaming through the thin curtains, feeling almost human again. My bus wasn't until afternoon, so I walked to a nearby diner for breakfast, then found a small local library where I could use a computer. Curiosity, or perhaps some need for validation, drove me to search for information about Harper's Hollow and the Harper family. I found nothing under that exact name, but I did discover records of a family named Harper who had settled in Monongahela County in the 1870s. According to county records, James and Elizabeth Harper, along with their 3 children, had abandoned their homestead in 1879 under unexplained circumstances. Their youngest son, Thomas, was listed as deceased, though no cause of death was recorded. I also found fragmentary references to a woman named Agatha Blackwood, locally known as Widow Blackwood, who had lived in the area during the same period. She was mentioned in several newspaper articles as a practitioner of folk remedies, who had been suspected of witchcraft by superstitious locals. One article, dated 1882, reported that her cabin had been burned by concerned citizens after several children went missing in the forest near her home. Blackwood herself was never found. The final piece of information I discovered was a brief mention in a book about West Virginia folklore, describing symbols matching those I'd seen carved into the trees, referred to as witch signs, believed to ward off or possibly communicate with forest spirits the locals called the Hollow Folk. These entities were described as shapeshifters who could appear as animals or people, but always with something not quite right about them. They were said to lure travelers deep into the forest where they would make them part of their family. A chill ran down my spine as I read those words. I closed the browser window, gathered my few belongings, and headed to the bus station, suddenly eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and the mountains of West Virginia. The journey home was uneventful, marked only by fitful sleep and the constant nagging feeling that I had brought something back with me from Harper's Hollow, some invisible taint or mark that set me apart from the normal people around me. I told myself it was just trauma, that time and distance would fade the nightmarish memories until they seemed like nothing more than a bad dream or campfire story. For a while, it seemed to work. I returned to my job, my apartment, my routine. I even started seeing my therapist again, though I never told her the full story, just that I'd gotten lost in the woods and had a panic attack. She prescribed anti-anxiety medication that helped me sleep through the night without dreaming of milky eyes and two wide smiles. But 3 weeks after my return, the whispering started again. At first, I thought it was just the pipes in my apartment building, or perhaps the wind through the alley outside my bedroom window. But gradually, it became unmistakable. Those same hushed, almost comprehensible voices I'd heard in the forest, now somehow inside my urban dwelling, inside my carefully reconstructed normal life. I began to notice other things too, symbols appearing on foggy mirrors after my shower, gone when I looked again. The brief glimpse of a too-tall figure watching me from across the street as I walked home from work. The neighbor's dog that now growled whenever I passed, its eyes fixed on me with an intelligence no animal should possess. And sometimes, at the threshold between waking and sleep, I would hear a child's voice, clear as day. "We're waiting, Rachel. Family always waits." Last night I woke to find mud on my bedroom floor, a trail of footprints too small to be mine, leading from my door to my bed and back again. When I followed them to my front door, I found it unlocked and slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered securing the deadbolt before going to bed. On my welcome mat lay a small, carefully arranged pile of bones. Bird bones, perhaps, or from some small rodent. And carved into my door, fresh and raw in the wood, was one of those symbols from the trees around Harper's Hollow. I'm writing this now from a hotel room across town. I've booked a flight for tomorrow, to my sister's place in Arizona, as far from the forests of Appalachia as I can get. I don't know if it will be far enough. Part of me fears that Harper's Hollow isn't a place at all, but a state of being that follows once you've been touched by it. But I have to try. If you're reading this, my final piece of advice is simple. Stick to marked trails when you hike. Don't venture into the deep, forgotten places in the woods. Don't follow strange animals or investigate ruins you stumble upon. And if you ever find yourself in West Virginia and hear whispers among the trees that almost sound like your name, run. Run, and don't look back. Because they're waiting in Harper's Hollow. They're always waiting, and their family is always looking to grow.